Chapter 549. I think it's better for me to go back. I've been out for 10 years and I'm starting to miss home. Fu Feng looked at him deeply and did not say much. The 6 of them left on the floating raft, leaving behind the complicated looks of the indigenous cultivators. They had to endure being controlled like this for thousands of years. When would it end? The 6 of them, needless to say, Fu Feng was someone who was sick of running around in the void of the universe. Although Lu Xiaoyi was still a Jin Dan who could not travel alone in the void, he had been out of the outer universe many times and was very familiar with it. Only the 4 curious babies on planet Hassa wished that they could grow a few more eyes along the way. Everything was new to them. This was a brand new world. Seeing such a mysterious universe, they felt that their cultivation journey was not in vain. As for what would happen when they went to the upper world and what kind of punishment they would receive, it didn't seem to be that important. Cultivation was like this. You would never know what was waiting for you in the future. It might seem like a disaster, but when you get closer, it might be a blessing. From afar, it might seem like a sweet date, but when you eat it, you will realize that it is a dumb worm. However, if you did not go anywhere, you might be safer, but you would also lose the chance to change, whether it was good or bad. 3 years later, in the Sword Chi Soaring Pavilion. This was a rare meeting. All the big shots of the pavilion were present. Perfected Lord Zhou Jiong, Perfected Lord Fu Feng, Perfected Lord Gongli, and many other perfected Yuanying. Lu Xiaoyi did not know many of them. He only knew Perfected Rui and Perfected Huang Tao. There were no other Jin Dan disciples present. In such an occasion, they did not have the right to speak. This was related to the outer universe or star. This was an area that the Hall Master's Jin Dan could not meddle in. They had no right to speak. There were many perfected beings and perfected lords in the hall, but there was only one person in the hall. Lu Xiaoyi stood there, his heart filled with emotions. He was considered a very special person among the group of swords outside Xianxiu Peak. He was interrogated when he first entered Xianyuan. Now that he was in Jin Dan, he was still interrogated. It seemed to have become a norm. In the circle of Dome Grand cultivators, he was probably the most frequently mentioned Golden Core cultivator. Well, he was also the most troublesome Foundation cultivator. For someone like him who only wanted to be a rice worm, this was really unbelievable. The changes in the world left one helpless. The conference was hosted by True Monarch Gongli. He was the true monarch in charge of external affairs in the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. Normally, he interacted with true monarchs and true monarchs, but today, he had to face a small Jin Dan. For a small Jin Dan to be able to cause so much trouble, it was also a skill, an ability to cause trouble. Jin Dan was not in the 5th ring to stir up trouble, but he was stirring up trouble outside the universe. This was a rare occurrence. Moreover, looking at this disciple's history, it wasn't the first time he caused trouble. When he was just a Foundation establishment cultivator, he was already able to cause a commotion in the 5th ring. Now that he had improved, he was starting to invade the universe? If this kind of trash really became a nascent soul, what would he bring to Xianyuan? He was really looking forward to it. The normal questions and answers were over. There were not many strange things on this trip to planet Hassa. Lu Xiaoyi did not mention the really strange things. First of all, he was not sure. Second of all, he was tired of this kind of endless questioning. He could not be completely honest. This was because there were more and more strange things on him. The storm caused by the sword spirit problem had just subsided. His life had finally become a little more normal after he succeeded in forming his gold core. Now he was involved in luck? What would the sect think? Sword spirit, luck, they were all at the highest level in cultivation, and he had them all. Even if the sect did not intend to cut him into pieces for research, he would still want to cut himself up. As for the kind-looking old man, the truth behind the 2 luck incidents of Bluebeard and Shaxing, he planned to completely understand it first. The cultivation world was a place where time was measured by years, or even centuries. There was no need to be too hasty. He also did not think that his concealment would cause any irreversible substantial impact to the sect or the 5th ring. He was just a Jean Dan. Many things that were extraordinary to him were nothing in the eyes of true monarchs and true monarchs. There was no reason for him to scare himself. But even if he did not say anything, for these real masters, they would be able to find some strange traces from the clues. Gonley went straight to the point. Billy of the Three Pure Ones disappeared in the 80s or 90s. At that time, he was also a popular candidate for forming his gold core. Now it seems that he was sent to planet Hassa when he was in the Foundation building stage. Then, he formed his gold core there. This can also explain his various behaviors. But what we are curious about is how a Foundation building cultivator could draw out the spiritual vigor under the blue bamboo shoots. This is the core of a planet. Not to mention a Foundation building cultivator like him, even true monarch Yuanying would find it difficult to do this. It is hard to imagine that he could do this without the help of others. You have to know that before he went to planet Hassa, he did not know about the existence of the blue bamboo shoots. The Three Pure Ones are indeed involved in a wide range of cultivation methods, but no matter how wide they are, it is impossible for a Foundation building cultivator to have the insight of a true monarch. What we want to know is, in the process of investigating the truth, did you feel that there were other hidden forces behind the scenes? Yes. Lu Xiaoyi did not avoid the question. The reason why I dawdled on planet Hassa for nearly 2 years before taking action is that I want to figure out the force behind this. But it takes time, a lot of time. Billy has been on planet Hassa for 80 years. Maybe this mysterious force has been there for even longer? Later, there was a change in the mine. I couldn't wait any longer, so I could only deal with the current situation. So, in my opinion, we should send True Monarch to planet Hassa as soon as possible to stabilize the situation. Gongli changed the topic. You said that you could also suppress the underground spiritual vigor, but you didn't do so. Why? Lu Xiaoyi had been mentally prepared for this. This was a hurdle he couldn't get around. The reason why I could suppress the spiritual vigor is that my spiritual power is not bad. The spiritual vigor in the core of planet Hassa has already been alive. It has taken the illusion of an old turtle. It needs spiritual communication. I was lucky and took the initiative and the communication. But in terms of Taoist heart, we cultivators should not suppress the upgrade of a world because of resources. This is not in line with the Tao of Heaven, especially when the natives of planet Hassa have already known the truth. The change of people's minds is unstoppable. In fact, his last sentence is the truth. Talking about Taoist heart is just a helpless excuse. The truth is that all the cultivators on planet Hassa know about this matter. If you hide it, you will definitely have resentment. If it accumulates over time, it is not conducive to Xuanyuan's control. Sooner or later, something bad will happen. The so-called Taoist heart is something that I can deceive you when you don't know about it. But when you know about it, I will use it to save face. This is a very particular thing in the inheritance of Taoism. If you build an ant road for ants, will they follow the ant road? Will they be grateful to you? So it's better not to build it. But when the ants have intelligence, it's another thing to build an ant road for them. Chapter 550. Moreover, from a technical point of view, I can't guarantee that I'll be able to push the geocentric spiritual opportunity back. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't lying. He really didn't know if the old turtle would really obey him if he insisted that it return to its original place. That was hundreds of thousands of years of suppression, a thought that gave birth to intelligence. You want it to return to its original place of suppression for hundreds of thousands of years with just one sentence? Asking the old turtle to retreat 1,000 feet and returning it to its original place of the geocentric are two different concepts. My control over the spiritual opportunity is very limited, and I don't understand its profound mechanism. I'm afraid that if I go too far, it will become willful and I won't be able to get anything out of it. It's better to let it spread to the human world. At the very least, it will gain a good reputation in the whirling cultivation world. Lu Xiaoyi paused for a moment. Of course, from a personal point of view, using the spiritual opportunity to benefit the human world is beneficial to my mental state of cultivation. true monarch Zhou Jiong interjected. From the beginning to the end, have you never thought about the influence the sect will receive? Lu Xiaoyi didn't hesitate at all. No! A swordsman shouldn't rely on external objects. This is the philosophy I formed from the first day I entered Xianyuan. I have never doubted this. The grand cultivators in the seats were constipated. He used such an excuse to absolve himself. You really couldn't say that he was wrong. Lu Xiaoyi was still chattering. Spirit, will, philosophy, tradition, and so on. Among all the influences that can be mentioned, resources should be ranked last. This is because a small receiver crystal can have a profound influence on the sword vein tradition that has been passed down for tens of thousands of years. This is unimaginable. I have never doubted that if it were any of my senior brothers, they would have made the opposite choice. Therefore, I've never thought about the influence of the sect. In front of so many grand cultivators, he used the sect's tradition to dilute the sect's resources. Only he could think of such a thing. Lu Xiaoyi's thoughts could not be hidden from these old foxes who had lived for hundreds and thousands of years. He was also very clear on this point. What he expressed was nothing more than his strong desire to survive, as well as the appropriate reason to seek leniency within the rules. Everyone knew the truth, but it depended on which side you favored. The mistake had already been made, and Xianyuan would never ruin the future of his disciples because of this. He was alone in this world, and the sect had given him the greatest power to do whatever he wanted. Now, the result was that this guy used this power to seek personal benefits for his own Taoist heart, and even spouted a bunch of high-sounding principles. Actually, the main reason was that he didn't want his state of mind to be tainted and affect his future cultivation. It was that simple. Gongli didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Based on his attitude, he had to be punished. Why? Was it reasonable to destroy the sect's most important mineral source? You actually have a third option. Maintain the status quo and wait for your ancestor Fufeng. The geocentric spiritual opportunity has been accumulating for hundreds of thousands of years. Waiting for the last few years won't make a difference. Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. With my cultivation, I can still suppress the natives in a short period of time. But if you want me to guard there for several years, once the natives' reinforcements arrive, I'm afraid I won't be able to control the situation. Moreover, I don't have the confidence to suppress the geocentric spiritual opportunity for 10 years. Fufeng spoke up for him from the side. The spiritual opportunity on Whirling Star is a bit strange. It's not completely self-generated. There should be a mysterious external force involved. I observed the formation of the great Tao laws at the scene, and it's not purely the nature of the spiritual opportunity. Therefore, it's indeed difficult for a Jin Dan like him to completely control the entire process. Shou Jing frowned. Junior Marshal brother, are you saying that there's an external force involved? Fufeng nodded. We can't judge its origin, but from the development of the matter, it can't be separated from the traces of human intervention. If we fail once, there will definitely be a next time. The several true immortals and perfected masters discussed for a moment, and they came to a conclusion. Lu Xi, let me ask you. When you made your choice, did you think from your own point of view first? Lu Xi sighed. Yes. I said that I thought about the glory of the sect first, and then the future of my fellow disciples and the peace of the universe. But no one believed me. Reverend Rui shouted from the side. Grand Master is asking you a question. Answer properly and speak human language. Don't be sarcastic and make it sound like you've been wronged. Lu Xiaoyi responded with a serious face. It wasn't that he was being sarcastic, but after so many years of observation, he discovered that within the Xianyuan sect, the Grand Master level figures were actually very tolerant of their juniors. They were old and experienced, and they had seen a lot. If you didn't make any fundamental mistakes, they would rarely deliberately make things difficult for you. Instead, it was the martial uncles and martial uncles who were more difficult to deal with. As grandmasters, they didn't like children who were well behaved. This was a typical generational tolerance. Part of the reason is that the Ksitigarbha spiritual opportunity has been exposed. Another part of the reason is that the spiritual opportunities upsurge can be controlled. But the main reason is that this disciple wants to have a perfect state of mind in the future. It's not that this disciple hasn't considered the loss of the sect. In any case, it shouldn't be a problem to hold on for a few thousand years. When this disciple becomes a nascent soul, I'll just go to the universe and look for a few rich minds. It's not a big deal. The group of reverends and perfected monarchs looked at each other. Gong Li was speechless. Go to the universe? A few rich minds? It's not a big deal? How dare you say that? Do you know that there are dozens of perfected monarchs and hundreds of reverends in our Xianyuan lineage? In the past 10,000 years, as long as we go out into the void of the universe, as long as there are strange celestial bodies, we'll go and investigate. We've never slacked off. Even so, there are only a few valuable minds in the universe. There's only one receiver mind, and it's the result of various coincidences. But when it comes to you, it's like a cabbage. You just go out for a walk and it's so easy? You treat the interests of the sect like child's play. Who's your master? How did he teach you? Lu Xiaoyi said in fear and trepidation. I've never taken him as my master. Gong Li did not give up. Which perfected master did you learn from? Reverend Rui was embarrassed. Cough, master, about that, he learned from this disciple for 15 years. Gong Li froze on the spot. How did this trouble fall on his head? The divine senses of the great cultivators collided, and they quickly reached a consensus. Although the trouble this time was indeed big and could affect the foundation of the external sword lineage for tens of thousands of years, they could not drag this guy out and behead him. Every swordsman was proud, not only of the inner sword, but also of the external sword. It was not the turn of a small Jin Dan to bear the responsibility of the rise and fall of the sect. As the group in charge of the Sword Aura Soaring Heaven Pavilion, they also had the responsibility. Why did they not strengthen the security of this only receiver mind planet? Why did they not know that there was a mysterious power involved? Why did they only realize something that happened 100 years ago only now? Why did they send this unreliable guy to carry out the mission? A true cultivator must be responsible and would not shirk responsibility. If they did not have such basic qualities, how could they cultivate to the level of Yuanying? A perfected lord? After reaching a consensus, there was no need to discuss the follow-up arrangements with this small Jin Dan. Gong Li's eyebrows were as sharp as knives. The Soaring Heaven Pavilion has concluded that Qianqiu Peak has no responsibility. Jin Dan cigarette but does not have to bear the main responsibility for the recovery of Hasastar's spiritual opportunity. Finding out the cause of Jin Dan's death in the upper realm is considered meritorious, but watching Hasastar's spiritual opportunity recover is a small mistake. Meritorious deeds offset the demerits. However, you secretly brought receiver crystals back to the mountain and hid 3 caddies, 2 tails and 5 coins. I'll punish you. When you come back, the Sword Chi Soaring Heaven Pavilion will carve your relationship into a record. You can bring it over, and in the future, you will receive your salary and eat there. Seeing this little Jin Dan walk out with a confused expression, everyone in the pavilion burst into laughter. They were not too concerned about losing their receiver crystal source. Just as Lu Xiaoyi had analyzed, the buffer period was very long, long enough for them to discover something in the universe. Most importantly, because there was solid evidence that Baihe, a cultivator of the 3 pure ones, was active on the whirling star, they had a reason to harass the ore rafts of the 3 pure ones in the void. They would take a share of all the similar soul-transmitting minerals of the 3 pure ones, regardless of whether the 3 pure ones were willing or not. Xianyuan had suffered a loss, so how could they swallow it silently? Fu Feng frowned. He rarely participated in the plans of the Sword Chi Soaring Heaven Pavilion. He was an idle person, so it was best for him to travel in the void of the universe. He was just an idle person in the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. Therefore, he was not particularly clear about the recent problems in Qikong. What happened in Qikong? Do we still need to send people back? Even if we do, What's the point of sending a Jean Dan back? Shou Jiong laughed. Junior brother, you should pay attention to the sex affairs when you have time. It's all recorded in the senior's record of events. Why didn't you read a single word? Qingkong's domain is a bit unstable. After tens of thousands of years, it's normal for some people to have thoughts about their ancestral land. Humans are always forgetful, and they need blood to wake up. However, since it's a matter of the domain, it's not good for Yuaning to intervene. Those sneaky people follow the rules very well because they're afraid of provoking the great cultivators of Xianyuan to take revenge. However, they also make it difficult for us to sweep the area. Therefore, we can only send some capable Jean Dan back to suppress them. You also know that there are very few outstanding people left in Qigong. Those with potential are all sent to the Five Rings Cross in gold. Therefore, they are at a disadvantage when fighting against other people's elites. It's also a joke. There's no need to take this too seriously. If we send a large number of people back, it would make Xianyuan look bad. Therefore, we only plan to send one person back who can kill people. On this matter, our outer sword and inner sword fought very fiercely. In the end, only this little guy called Cigarette but gained the recognition of both sides. The outer sword treats him as one of us, and the inner sword doesn't treat him as an outsider. Therefore, Fu Feng laughed. So it turns out that regardless of the matter of planet whirling, he still has to go back. You guys are so pretentious. Do you have to go so far? Shou Jiang sighed. This little guy is too good at causing trouble. He has been causing trouble since he was in the foundation establishment stage. First, he caused trouble in the dome, then he caused trouble in the fish leaping cliff, and now he has conquered a domain. These are all big scenes. If he can handle them, it means that he is also capable in this aspect. It's not enough for a swordsman to only know how to kill people. He also needs to know how to kill people. Who to kill and who to pull? Who to attack and who to isolate and unite. There are many powerful sword cultivators among the gold core cultivators, and they are not young either. They have a wide network of connections, and they have concerns. There will always be a time when they can't display their full potential. Therefore, we want to send a new face over. He is bold and powerful, and we don't have to be afraid of him. He can go all out and do it. After that, we will come forward and mediate. Gong Li also laughed. He likes to show off. My principle in Xianyuan is to give him a stage to show off. As long as he can show off, I don't mind helping him wipe his ass. Of course, this was also under the tacit approval of Wen Guangfeng and the Thunder Palace. If it were someone else, the inner sword would not have been so easy to talk to. Gong Li then turned to Zhenren Rui. The matter of planet whirling cannot be left unchecked. We used to be stationed in Jindan, including the investigation of cigarette butts. No matter how much he investigates, he is limited by his strength and realm. Some things are hard to find. You have to choose someone from Yuaning. He has to be cautious and reliable. His strength cannot be weak. That place is likely to become a place of trouble. We need to establish communication. We can't wait until the soul lamp is extinguished to find out that something has happened there. You go and set up a plan. Zhenren Rui nodded. In the Rising Heaven Pavilion, the sages all set the general direction. They did not care about the specific operations or the allocation of personnel. This was also a characteristic of Xianyuan. More than 10,000 years ago, Xianyuan still had the position of sect leader. However, after 10,000 years of development, they found that it was not necessary. The power of Xianyuan was in the hands of the Thunder Palace and the Rising Heaven Pavilion. It would be very awkward to have an additional sect leader. Their will could not be conveyed, and no one was willing to do such a thankless job. Therefore, they decided to just cancel it. The matter they discussed in the Rising Heaven Pavilion today was the final decision. At most, they would inform the Thunder Palace afterwards. Chapter 552. Lu Xiaoyu walked out of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion in a daze. He still did not understand why he was kicked back to clear sky by the sect. Clear Sky might be Xuanyuan's base, but it might not be Lu Xiaoyi's hometown. His hometown was in the lower 3-star region. Seeing that the fifth ring was about to pass through his hometown, he went in the opposite direction. However, with his current Jin Dan level, even if he passed by his hometown, he would not be able to go up, right? The great cultivators in the sect would not waste time and resources to send a Jin Dan back to his hometown just because he wanted to bring glory to his ancestors. Therefore, it did not matter. Faced with this kind of mission, or rather, exile, the first person he thought of was senior sister Yanqing. She was old Clear Sky, so she would definitely be familiar with the people and geography there. Although information about Clear Sky could be seen everywhere in the Boa Tower, and it was the most comprehensive star region in Xuanyuan's treasury, it was one thing to read about it, and another to listen to people talk about it. He didn't expect that when he rushed over in such a hurry, he would end up with nothing. Yanqing had already left the dome to explore the fifth ring mission. This made him very disappointed. He didn't have to get anything from his senior sister, but he knew that this senior sister was cold on the outside but warm on the inside. She was very homesick and often missed the blue sky of her hometown. If there was scenery that she missed, there would definitely be people that she missed. The distance between Clear Sky and the fifth ring was too far. Not to mention Jin Dan cultivators like them, even Yuanying who could float in the void might not have a chance to go back. This was a rare opportunity. At least he could help senior sister see the people and things she cared about. Yanqing's mission was not difficult to find. It was a mission to lead Foundation establishment cultivators to participate in a spiritual assembly, just like when he went to temple to participate in 100 vying barges. However, this was a grand event for Foundation establishment cultivators. Their current mission was to escort them from afar. In the fifth ring, there were as many spiritual assemblies as there were hairs on a cow. This was the place where spiritual connections flourished. There were all kinds of strange things. The big powers would organize big events, the small powers would organize small events, and the small powers would organize together. There were all kinds of names and rules, and the purpose was to build relationships and increase connections. In a place like the fifth ring, connections were very important. This was because the small and medium-sized sects lived in the cracks between the big powers. How could there be balance? You don't even know him, so you can't talk to him. You're not old friends. Where did the connections come from? After Jin Dan's Yuanying, it would be very difficult to establish friendships between cultivators. This was because the more they saw, the more things they had to consider. It would be very difficult for them to open their hearts to each other. Therefore, most of the Dharma assemblies above the fifth ring were the Foundation establishment Dharma assemblies. This was because there were still gaps in their mental state among all the cultivation realms. The spiritual assembly that Smoky Ends led was very special. Using the concepts from Lu Xiaoyi's previous life, it was a women's assembly, 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 and so on. This kind of convention was held on a large scale within the entire fifth ring, and there were also branches in various regions. For example, this time, it was the women's convention in the western regions. It was held once every 30 years. Everyone sat together to exchange friendships, share their sorrows, recall the past, summarize the present, and look forward to the future. This time, the location of the assembly was Splendid Garden. It was held by a sect in the western regions, where Yin flourished and Yang declined. It was quite far from the dome, and there was the possibility of traveling to other places for sightseeing. It was hard to say how long it would take, and he might not be able to make it back before leaving the fifth ring. The relationship between the Xianyuan Sword faction and Splendid Garden was very ordinary. The Kun cultivators of Splendid Garden seemed to prefer elegant Dharma Meridian cultivators, but they were not interested in the unyielding swordsmen. In the western regions, the sects could communicate with each other instantly. However, that was only for important matters between the sections. For personal matters like this, there was no reason to use the sect's communication system. In other words, he had no way of contacting Smoky Ends unless Smoky Ends took the initiative to contact the sect. he decided to make a trip personally. His speed was very fast, and it was completely different from Smoky N's flying devices. He estimated that a trip to Splendid Garden would take less than 2 months. There was still time. There was still half a year before the sect sent the ferry to the Blue Sky sect. During this time, it would be very difficult for him to calm down and cultivate. For Jean Dan, one deduction of martial arts would take at least a few months. What could he do in such a short time? Instead of being uncomfortable in the dome, it was better to go out and relax. Finally, he could see the beautiful scenery of the fifth ring. He had a hunch that this trip to the Blue Sky sect would not be short. He was afraid that it would take at least 100 years. If he could not form his nascent soul, it was hard to say whether he would be able to come back. He needed to say goodbye to his friends. At the same time, he also needed to think about what he needed to take with him during the trip. He liked to think about problems while flying, and this process was just right. There was no need to report to anyone. Now, no one would care about his situation. The palace masters of Jean Dan could not control him, and he was too lazy to go to the High Heaven Pavilion. He wanted to see the two loathsome brothers. Thus, he flew out of the dome and headed towards the southwest. Ever since he formed his gold core, his cultivation had been very regular for the first 20 years. On Whirling Planet, he could be considered to have achieved some success. He had laid a solid foundation on the Tao of the Five Elements, so he did not waste much time. For him, cultivation also had its own difficulties. It had been nearly 100 years since the birth of the last sword spirit of the Navy on the fish-leaping cliff, but no sword spirit had been born. He did not know what the problem was. Perhaps, he was gradually becoming ordinary. The progress of the sword spirit had stagnated, but it was compensated by the luck-intercepting cloud. He, who had integrated with nature's luck, now had the possibility of soaring in another aspect. He did not know what the final result would be, but subconsciously, he knew that this was very important. It would be of great help to his future understanding of the Tao realm. In terms of the cultivation system, there was not much difference between the fifth ring and Qin Kong. Basically, Qin Kong had everything that the fifth ring had, especially those core things. Therefore, he did not need to go to the Boa Tower to plunder some cultivation techniques that he might practice in the future. Instead, it would mess up his rhythm. However, Qin Kong did not have enough resources and materials. Shinran Rui had also reminded him of this. After all, this was a bandit's den, and materials were extremely abundant. It was not as peaceful as Qin Kong, where there were few cultivators and they would not drift in the universe. Who could he rob? In careful planning, Lu Xiaoyi did not stop. The Jean Dan swordsman who appeared in the sky above the western regions rarely dared to provoke him. He did not cause trouble either. Occasionally, he would turn a blind eye to the attacks of the spiritual vigor. He did not have the time to care about these things. So focused on flying, it only took him about 20 days to enter the territory of Jinxiu Garden. The surrounding scenery became beautiful, completely different from the magnificent snow-capped mountains on the dome. As he continued to go deeper, there were already cultivators of Jinxiu Garden politely coming up to ask him questions. He suddenly realized that he was a man. How could he openly enter the scene of the women's conference? Chapter 553. When Lu Xiaoyi got closer to the meeting place, he realized that he was overthinking things. Women's assembly was not something you could understand from the word list. It was an all-women's gathering. Just as men's gatherings were always adorned with beautiful maids, women, in their pursuit of equality, used a lot of mediocrity in their large gatherings. They were basically Qianxiu and Foundation Establishment Qianxiu, so they weren't hard to find. Splendid Garden itself was a force wherein flourished and yang declined, but that didn't mean that they didn't exist. In addition to the wild bees and butterflies among the surrounding small sects and rogue cultivators, it was enough for a conference. There were always people who wanted to use some kind of shortcut to achieve their goals. The resource poor Qianxiu hoped to pave the path of cultivation through so-called Tao companions. The Qianxiu, who had no food left at home, also wanted to take a step forward through dual cultivation. In the cultivation world, this kind of happy cultivation would never go out of style. Instead, it was becoming more and more mainstream, large-scale, and industrialized. Lu Xiaoyu rarely came into contact with these things because he had been placed in the most powerful forces of this star field from the very beginning, and had quickly made a name for himself. He had always been at the top of the food chain, and the levels he came into contact with were also very high, making cultivation a very easy thing. In fact, real cultivation was not like this. The Kuinxiu conference was located in an open area called the Mountain and Water Swamp. It was a large swamp very far away from Splendid Garden's mountain gate. A swamp, as the name implied, was a place where poisonous miasma ran rampant, ferocious beasts lurked around, and dense with traps. It was a place where mortals were extinct. The Mountain and Water Swamp was originally such a place, but that was 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years later, under the perseverance of the people of Splendid Garden, the Mountain and Water Swamp was reborn. They used facts to tell others that the swamp actually had a beautiful side. The sword range would never do such a boring thing. Whatever it was now. They would not make any changes to the dome. However, Splendid Garden would not. They did not have the strength to choose the territory they liked. They were passively assigned here. They could only use the power of cultivation to change nature. Fortunately, their orthodoxy was very good in this aspect. This was also the reason why they were close to the Dharma vein. Various kinds of beautiful swamp plants were transplanted, countless pure herbivorous animals were raised, and the 5 elements under the swamp were imperceptibly influenced. Even though the change was very slow, after more than 10,000 years of persistence, the mountains and rivers of the swamp had completely changed. This was the choice of a Confucian orthodoxy that loved beauty. There was no good or bad about it. Everyone had their own eyes. At least from Lu Xiaoyi's point of view, the poisonous insects in the original Shanshui swamp were innocent. They were almost extinct in the place where they lived because they were not beautiful. The current landscape was completely different. Looking down from the sky, one could see flowers blooming like a piece of brocade, thousands of miles of beautiful scenery. The miasma was gone, and the poisonous insects were extinct. It was like a huge paradise on earth. Of course, mortals still couldn't enter. They would still be trapped and become fertilizer for the swamp. The poisonous miasma was gone, but there was still the flower miasma, which was equally fatal. It was very suitable to hold a gathering of Kun cultivators in such a place. Colorful clothes and fresh flowers set off each other. Laughter accompanied the cries of cranes, and there were no signs of a bandit's lair. There were no defensive formations and no cultivators on duty. The women's gathering in the 5th ring was the safest gathering. No one would be blind enough to come and cause trouble, because you would never know who was standing behind them. If you weren't careful, you would end up as an enemy of the entire region. Therefore, the women's gathering was very open. They didn't reject strangers. Kun guests were welcomed, and Qian guests were entertained. As long as you showed respect to the Kun cultivators, it was fine. The nature of such a gathering was very attractive. Of course, Qian cultivators with real prospects and potential wouldn't come. In order to avoid unnecessary trouble, Lu Xiaoyi dressed himself in a straw hat. This was because he had been too conspicuous at the fish leaping cliff. Tens of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators had looked at him for 10 years. This appearance was no longer a secret in the 5th ring. He was the most famous red cultivator back then. Although he was a little past his prime now, he still had the foundation. It was certain that he would be recognized at such a gathering. The straw hat meant to tell others openly that he didn't want to reveal his identity due to personal reasons. It was a kind concealment, and not a deliberate use of a secret technique to change his appearance. It was fine if he wasn't discovered, but if he met someone who was sensitive, in this aspect, it would be easy for others to misunderstand. Although it was a gathering of foundation establishment cultivators, there were also many Jin Dan cultivators like Yan Chen who had led teams. Their skills were profound, especially the Dharma Meridian cultivators. This was especially true for women. They had terrifying talent in the aspect of appearance. Lu Shi didn't dare to show his slight skill in front of them. However, his eyes weren't idle. They were watery, ripe, and had been used by pigs, but had never been used by pigs. They were a feast for the eyes. It was also a pity that he only found out about such a good gathering now. Even if he did, it was too late. He was about to leave this place full of life. It was melancholy. In his impression, the so-called home, the so-called place where the sword was drawn, Qing Kong was a place for retirement, right? A place for retirement also meant that it was dry, boring, and monotonous. This might have been suitable for his previous mindset as a rice worm, but not now. Life was like this. When you wanted to be a rice worm, the heavens would definitely throw you into a bandit's den. When you were used to the bandit's way of life, the heavens would throw you back into a rice bag. However, before his beauty viewing experience even began, it ended. A foundation establishment Jin Shio female cultivator came up to him. His attire wouldn't be a problem outside, but in this place, he didn't fit in with the atmosphere. Everyone else had pretty faces, but he had a straw hat that obscured his face. He was dressed in black, and it was especially out of place. Everyone else was admiring the flowers and grass, but he was carrying a big sword case. "Where are you from, esteemed guest? Do you need the Jin Shio to guide you?" The Jin Shio female cultivator was very courteous. Although she couldn't discern the cultivation level of the Jin Dan under Lu Xiaoyi's divine concealment spell, she couldn't neglect the sword case on his back. The only thing she wasn't sure of was which sword vein this guest was from. Xianyuan? Wei Sword Mountain? Yunding? From a geographical point of view, the possibility of it being a Xianyuan swordsman was the highest. However, from the way things were done, there had never been a Xianyuan male swordsman who took the initiative to participate in such activities. The Wei Sword Mountain was even more so. Instead, it was the Yunding swordsman who was the most likely. They had a good relationship with the Dharma sect. If he was really from the Yunding, she had to remind him to be careful. There was also a group of female tigers from the Dongding participating in this event. "There's no need to trouble yourself. Just tell me where the Xianyuan swordsman is, and I'll go there myself." Looking at the cautious expression on the little Jin Shio's face, he suddenly understood and laughed. "You're thinking too much. I'm also from Xianyuan. I'm looking for them for something, not for a fight." The Shanshui swamp was thousands of miles wide. In such an occasion, it wasn't appropriate to use one's divine sense to scan the area. It was disrespectful. Lu Xiaoyi came from a big family, and he placed great importance on such etiquette. This was also the best way to reduce trouble. He wasn't the main character of a novel who attracted hatred everywhere. Chapter 554. Kun Xiu dutifully led him to the Xianyuan swordsman's encampment. He only left when he saw that he had a normal conversation with the swordsman. He was very careful. "Where's your martial aunt Yen Tsang? Where did she go?" Lu Xiaoyi acted like an old man. He still did not want anyone to know of his arrival, even if it was a disciple of his own sect. His reputation in the external sword sect was a small legend and would attract more curious gazes. In essence, he was the kind of person who would not tell others how awesome he was. This gave him a sense of satisfaction. The female swordsman had a heroic look on her face. "Martial aunt went to meet some friends and will be back later. Hey, who are you? Are you hiding your head and tail and not daring to show your face? I've never seen any of the disciples of Qianxiu peak like you. You're a disgrace to our sword vein." Lu Xiaoyi lowered his voice and chuckled. "Your martial aunt knows who I am. As for you guys, I'm not sure. I'm afraid your martial aunt will be unhappy." The heroic sword cultivator was very suspicious, but he had the sword talisman in his hand and the sword case with him, so it couldn't be fake. He kept staring at him, thinking in his heart, could it be that this is Martial Uncle's lover? I've never heard of it. Martial Aunt is a famous ice fairy in Qianxiu Peak. How could she have such a thing in private? Moreover, It's a guy who doesn't even dare to show his face. Lu Xiaoyi ignored her. Since he was going to meet up with his friends, he didn't mind spending some time here. Since he was here, he could just take a stroll around. It would be a feast for his eyes before he left the Fifth Ring Road. Thus, he began to wander around. Although his face was covered by a straw hat, his eyes were bright, and he imitated him. That heroic sword cultivator was worried, so he kept following behind him. Both of them were carrying sword sheaths, and they seemed to be companions. Thus, no one came up to ask anything. There were countless beauties in the mountains and lakes, which made Lu Xiaoyi sigh. He had always been focused on cultivation, which made his life seem a lot paler. It was a pity that he was missing Ziyi. Life had to be colorful. It was not to say that a cultivator only cared about cultivation. That was incomplete. Cultivation was a systematic project. It was not limited to mana and sword techniques. Things on the spiritual level were also very important. It could allow a cultivator to have a complete personality and not be a tool for cultivation. It was only after he formed his gold core that he began to gradually understand these things. When he was in the foundation building realm, in order to survive in a bandit's den, he had no choice but to give up a lot of happiness in life. Now that he had a certain amount of ability to survive, he couldn't continue to cultivate so painstakingly. While he was strolling in front, the heroic swordsman behind him was taking notes in her heart. She was a very talented person in management, and she was also consciously developing in this direction. She was very organized and good at using data to speak for herself. For example, while tailing him, she carefully distinguished this person's characteristics and preferences, and made a chart for him in her heart. When this person looked at people, the first thing he looked at was not the face, but the chest, followed by the buttocks, the figure, and finally the face. There was also a very important discovery. Based on the length of his gaze, this person spent far more time looking at those who had a cultivation partner or were married than those who were unmarried. Whether a 5-ringed Kun cultivator had a cultivation partner or not, one could basically tell from their hairstyle. Women and young girls were different. Of course, experts did not need to look at their hairstyle. They could also tell from their figure. She had recorded all these in a small notebook in her heart. She just had to wait for her martial uncle to come back and complain. As he wandered around the mountains and lakes, Lu Xiaoyi discovered a strange phenomenon. There were clusters of flowers in the lakes, but there was only one type that was tightly shut with wide leaves. It did not emit fragrance, and was not beautiful. This did not make sense. It was the end of spring and the beginning of summer, and the climate in this area was mild. Looking at the flourishing leaves, it was the time of the year when vitality was the most vigorous. Why was it so abnormal? His knowledge of plants was very limited. His pitiful knowledge came from the few species in Poo's city's Lu province. As for the impressions from his previous life, they were meaningless here. They were not a plant system. After 200 years of cultivation, there were too many things that needed to be learned. It was not enough for him to put effort into plants and flowers. Therefore, he did not recognize this plant. However, this type of plant was widely distributed in the mountains and swamps. There were at least 100 million of them in a radius of 1,000 miles. As a whole, their leaves were closed, causing the landscape of the mountains and swamps to lose some color, although he did not know what color it was. It was very strange to leave such a regret in such a grand event. However, he did not want to do anything. He did not even want to ask anything. He was a layman when it came to plants. Appropriate concealment of his shortcomings was the most basic quality of a pretender. The sky gradually darkened. Lu Xiaoyi began to walk back. Following behind him was the heroic swordsman who had worked hard without complaint for half a day. Her little notebook was almost full. It was enough to make this guy suffer. Nighttime was meaningless to cultivators. They did not have the habit of resting at sunset like mortals. Although most of the people here were Kun cultivators, there were always heroic and generous people who sang to their heart's content. However, every low-level cultivator would not waste the time of the heavens at night. Everything would make way for the heavens. This was the source of their power. Cultivation depended on diligence, and desolation depended on pleasure. Everyone understood this. When he arrived at the Xianyuan swordsman's encampment in the mountains and lakes, the situation in front of him was beyond his expectations. More than 100 Xianyuan female swordsmen were gathered here. There were both outer sword and inner sword. Moreover, there were still people coming back. It was really a big lineup. Lu Xiaoyi did not know that there were so many women in his sect. Each of them was full of heroic spirit. It seemed very normal in the tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi saw his senior martial sister from afar. There was also someone he did not expect, the inner sword Gong Xiao Dai. This was also very normal. With so many Foundation establishment cultivators here, it was normal for there to be a Jin Dan from each of the inner and outer sword vein. Under the watchful eyes of so many people, he could not show too much eagerness. Especially when there were two of them. Who to greet first was a test of his IQ. Therefore, he let the follower rush to the front. After whispering to each other, Yanqing came forward. Gong Xiaodai gestured from a distance and turned around. Look at her IQ, she was several streets ahead of Lu Xiaoyi. Looking at the guy under the straw hat, Yanqing did not know whether to laugh or cry. Little E, if you go out now, you'll look like a typical flower thief. Lu Xiaoyi gladly accepted. There are too many flowers. Even a thief's eyes are blurred. There are so many orioles and swallows. It's so annoying. Yanqing keenly turned around and looked in the direction Gong Xiaodai left. You know her? When did you hook up with her? I've never heard of her. Your mission is so urgent, but you still have time to do these things? Lu Xiaoyi was very dissatisfied. Senior martial sister, your words are too harsh. We're just friends, okay? She's from my hometown. Among the 10 people who were abducted together, she was the only one who reached this step. The others are all. Chapter 555. After their brief exchange, Yanqing was bewildered. Little E, did you just come back? I didn't hear anything from you when I left after accepting the mission. Why are you in such a hurry? Is there something urgent? Lu Xiaoyi smiled mischievously as usual. Isn't it because I miss you, senior sister? A month apart feels like 3 years. I haven't seen you for more than 10 years. You don't even know how much I miss you. Smokey interrupted his mushy words. In the end, you came here to look at other people's girls? Little E, you need to change that habit of yours. You'll get beaten up. All right, let's talk like a normal person. What's the matter? The two stood shoulder to shoulder and walked to a corner of the station. Of course, they couldn't escape the eyes of the hundreds of female swordsmen. Yanqing didn't care about it, and Lu Xiaoyi didn't care about it either. He just let these guys think whatever they want. I accepted a new mission. In 4 to 5 months, I'll be going to Qingkong on the ferry. I don't think I'll be able to come back anytime soon. I'm worried that you won't be able to make it back in time. So I came to find you. I want to know if there's anything you need me to do in Qingkong. For example, if there's a sister who needs me to take care of her, I can give her warmth for free. Listening to Lu Xiaoyi's habit of talking nonsense, Yanqing knew that he was concerned about her. She did have a lot of people and things that she missed in the Green Sky sect. Unfortunately, she couldn't go back. She also knew that the reason why the sect allowed Lu Xiaoyi, a foreign cultivator, to go back was definitely not because he was familiar with the Green Sky sect. There must be another purpose. This was not something she should ask. She had a lot of things to worry about, but she couldn't put them all on her friends. There were some things that she had to deal with on her own. There were some things that she could only think about but not touch. Of course, there were also some things that she had to entrust. She had been in the 5th ring for more than 200 years. There were some things that she couldn't afford to delay. If she really went back after she became a nascent soul, many people and things would be gone. There had to be a conclusion, even if it wasn't a good one. The conversation between the two lasted for the first half of the night, causing the hundreds of female swordsmen's curiosity to burn even more fiercely. They scratched their ears and cheeks, unable to find a place to put their thoughts. When did the famous Ice Mountain fairy fall? Just by looking at the way they were conversing with one another, one could tell that their relationship was definitely not simple. Their heads were very close to one another, shoulder to shoulder. They could even sense one another's spiritual perception. Was there a need for that? However, what shocked them even more was that after this masked man had intimate interactions with the outer sword Jean Dan in the first half of the night, he actually ran over to the inner sword Gong Xiaodai in the second half of the night. Similarly, they stood shoulder to shoulder and whispered into each other's ears. This made people puzzled. What kind of triangular relationship was this? Was the private life of a domed swordsman really that messy? It was already dawn. Lu Xiaoyi and Gong Xiaodai actually did not talk much about anything else. They mostly talked about the past of old friends. In fact, they did not interact much. Apart from the fact that they both came from the same planet, there was almost no interaction between them on the 5 rings. However, only Lu Xiaoyi knew that under Gong Xiaodia's flirtatious appearance, her heart towards the sword was not inferior to senior sister Yan Cheng's in the slightest. It was only because of their personalities that they presented themselves differently to the outside world. Both of them had a dedication towards the sword, perseverance towards the Tao, and a strong will to move forward alone. Counting from the time that the lower 3 stars stepped onto the airship to receive Chaoguang, almost 240 years had passed. Out of the 10 of them, only the 2 of them were left. This was truly cruel. Under the erosion of time, it was even crueler than the flying swords. I don't care what your reason is for coming here. I don't care about the mask, but you can stop pretending to be a cultivator. Even I can see it, let alone those experts with Dharma meridians. Furthermore, as a Foundation establishment cultivator, it's not suitable for you to mingle with a group of women. It's easy for people to talk about Xuanyuan's innocence. It's more natural for you to come here as an escort for Jean Dan. Yes. Lu Xiaoyi's mood was very calm. His fellow countrymen had all fallen behind. It all depended on how long the 2 of them could last. He still had to experience this kind of relationship in the future, and no one could predict it. Early in the morning, after the end of the heavenly ceremony, it was the beginning of another joyous day. When the Xianyuan cultivators discovered the powerful aura emitted by the masked guests, they came to a realization. How could the 2 martial uncles take a fancy to an ordinary person? As expected, it was another martial uncle Jean Dan. The question was, which one was it? Don't you need to go back and prepare? All kinds of resources, blue sky is definitely not as abundant as the 5 rings. Yanqing asked. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. You'll never be able to prepare everything. Because you'll never know how far you'll go. What do you need to use? You can only take one step at a time. Besides, doesn't blue sky have other sects? If you really don't have enough resources, you can always ask them for help. There's no need to force yourself into a corner right now. I won't be able to see senior sister for a long time. I'll stay here for a few more days and chat with senior sister. Yanqing immediately exposed him. You don't want to chat with me. You just can't let go of all these beautiful women, right? Little E, let me tell you. It's not that senior sister is boasting, but in terms of beauty, blue sky is even better than the 5 rings. Lu Xiaoyi's eyes lit up. Listening to senior sister's words is better than studying for 10 years. If you say so, then I'm willing to go. Yanqing couldn't do anything about him. This guy's sloppy attitude was fused into his blood and couldn't be changed. In fact, she didn't want him to change either. Only then would she feel closer to him, like a family member, a younger brother who would never grow up. I still can't accompany you during the day. There are some things I need to discuss. You're going to look around anyway, so it suits you. Lu Xiaoyi was disdainful. What's there to discuss between you 2? It's all about those trivial matters between women. You're doing it so formally. Don't tell me you want to overturn the 5 rings and seize power? Turn this place into a matriarchal society? Of course, I'll support you unconditionally. Yanqing was annoyed. Nothing good comes out of a dog's mouth. How are we not serious matters? For example, right now, in Mountain River Swamp, there's something that can't be considered a big deal. Those crabapple bananas suddenly stopped blooming, causing the sisters to worry. Forget it, you wouldn't understand even if I told you. Even if all the flowers and plants in Mountain River Swamp died, you wouldn't care, right? Lu Xiaoyi reacted. Crabapple bananas? Are you talking about those autistic flowers and plants? I was wondering why this Mountain River Swamp was missing something. So it was an accident. I wonder what kind of accident would cause a plant species to not give you face? Yanqing sighed. There's no reason at all. The mount of a fellow Taoist who was participating in the conference inexplicably bit the crabapple banana master of Mountain River Swamp. In the end, the two sides fought fiercely. The flower master couldn't move and wasn't good at fighting, so it suffered a great loss. So overnight, all the crabapple bananas in Mountain River Swamp closed their leaves and shut their flowers. That's what you're seeing now. Chapter 556. P.S. Check your pockets to see if there are any votes left. If you don't vote now, you won't get double votes after the event. Sloth is doing his best. I need monthly votes to finish this story today. Also, friends on other platforms and pirated versions, can't you support Sloth on the next Chidian app during the Double Festival? The data is a bit awkward. I need everyone's support. Yanqing went to participate in the discussion of their so-called important matters, how to persuade the begonia flower owner to bloom again. Lu Xiaoyi continued his journey of finding beautiful women. He left the matter of flowers and plants to the women. Of course, the plants in the cultivation world were different from those in the mortal world. It was possible for them to develop intelligence, absorb sunlight and moonlight, and cultivate into spirits. For example, in this mountain and swamp, after thousands of years of nourishment, it was normal for one or two plants to become spirits. It was nothing new in the cultivation world. Plants becoming spirits was very complicated and couldn't be generalized. It was as simple as beasts. It was just a change in form, developing a hide bone and speaking human language. Plants needed to go through the evolution of species before they could transform into humans and mingle in the mortal world. Beasts developed intelligence and cultivated by eating qi. Most of them could transform into humans and learn human language when they built their foundation. Of course, it had a deep relationship with the bloodline of the species. Pigs, cows, and sheep were slower and their transformation was not complete. They might need to form their essence before people could see their true roots. However, peacocks were not so difficult. After all, they were from the quasi-sages and were born with the advantage of bloodline. It was much more difficult for plants to become spirits. When they ate qi, they began to swallow qi and were almost no different from ordinary grass. When they built their foundation, they had preliminary intelligence, but they still couldn't transform into humans. This was only possible when they reached the Jingdan realm. It was not absolute. Most of the plant spirits of Jingdan could only cultivate silently in the same place. All of this would change completely after they formed their nascent souls. There was no other reason. Beasts could transform into flesh, blood, bones, skin, and internal organs. It was just a change in form. However, plants had to go through the process of transforming into living creatures. It was very difficult. It would take a long time to refine. Either it would appear in a remote place deep in the mountains and forests, where it would not be disturbed, or it would be carefully taken care of in a human's back garden. Other than that, it would be difficult to survive. It would be very easy for it to be plucked and refined into elixirs before it was fully formed. Based on the classification of monsters, plant fairies were definitely inferior to beasts in terms of combat prowess. This was because plant fairies did not have any combat experience during their growth. The limited combat experience they had was nothing more than the occasional beasts that accidentally entangled and suffocated them. This was basically meaningless in a real battle. Of course, plants were also divided into species. Ordinary species like the begonia banana could only grow step by step, but some natural variants were different, such as the gourd brothers of the spirit gourd cave. The mount of a Jingdan cultivator would definitely be at the level of a Jingdan. At this level of combat experience, it could not be said that it was not rich. To be able to be chosen as the mount of a cultivator, its aptitude would definitely not be mediocre. Therefore, when facing the most ordinary plant fairies, it was very normal for it to have an advantage. Fortunately, this was the place where the cultivators were holding a meeting. If there were no humans watching over it, it was afraid that even its roots would be dug out and eaten. One of the main characteristics of plant fairies was that they were the best nourishment. Everything could be eaten, unlike demonic beasts which had many parts that could not be eaten. One could not blame the demonic beasts for being cruel. In this aspect, humans were the cruel ancestors. Thinking about it, this begonia flower lord also had a bad temper. When it was wronged, it simply influenced all the begonia bananas in the mountain swamp to shut themselves up to express its dissatisfaction. Yan Chang and the others went to discuss countermeasures, wanting this meeting to be more successful. In fact, it was unnecessary. Plant fairies were all ghouls and would not listen to advice. Unless that troublemaker Jean Dan's mount was beheaded, how could that be possible? If you want to beat a dog, you have to look at its master. He did not deliberately look for the begonia flower lord, there was no need to add to this mess. He just moved with the crowd, like a little tramp on a public bus. It was hard to explain his mentality. It was probably because after being lonely for a long time, he wanted to be close to the crowd and comfort his heart that was gradually becoming cold and hard. Everyone had their own way of resolving the negative energy. After a long time of cultivation, this kind of state of mind would silently affect the cultivator. Under the circumstances where the cultivator was unaware of it, if the cultivator ignored it, it was the best time for the demons to invade the heart. He did not know how others did it, but he had his own way. For example, right now, he was tailing, blending in. He listened to everything, even if it was a household talk, oil, salt, and vinegar, he did not feel bored. In fact, it was a kind of relaxation, even if this kind of relaxation was a bit wretched. Why not? If he had to get close to the crowd, why not get close to the beautiful girls? Could it be that he had to find a place where demonic beasts gathered and looked fierce? The smell of cosmetics was better than the smell of blood. In 10 days, the thousands of cultivators who participated in the convention knew about this person. Straw Hat Jean Dan. He seemed to be the cultivator escort of Xianyuan. He liked to follow behind the crowd and eat farts. No matter what they talked about, he would have the nerve to stick his ear out. Even if it was some private matters of the cultivators, there would occasionally be bold and straightforward female cultivators who would criticize him with a few words. He was not angry, and would leave with a smile. He was also a strange person. Yanqing could not do anything to him, but he could not just chase him away like this, right? He did not do anything bad, he was just a little wretched. Tomorrow is the last day. There will be a few famous life elemental Jean Dan from the Dharma lineage preaching. It will be the end of the convention. Lu Xiaoyi was still a bit unsatisfied. It's over already? Isn't it too rushed? The problem of the begonia flower lord has not been solved, right? We can't leave any regrets. Yanqing was speechless. It's so hard for you to still think about the begonia flower lord. There's no other way. We've used all the methods we could. Even the owner of Splendid Garden could not make it change its mind. You know how stubborn the spirits of plants are. They really have a one-track mind. Lu Xiaoyi asked casually. Who is the owner of the mount? Is it difficult to apologize and make up for it? Is face so important? Let the thousands of people here be disappointed? Yanqing thought about it and decided to tell him the truth. He did not say it before because he was afraid that this guy would go out and cause trouble. This person was too ruthless and could not be stopped. She is a special guest of Splendid Garden, an important guest, Nishang Fairy. She comes from the top cultivation clan of the Three Pure Ones, There are countless perfected cultivators and perfected cultivators in the clan. I heard that there are also half-immortals. In terms of clans, she is one of the top 3 clans in the 5 rings. Originally, even if she came to the western regions with such a background, she would still have to abide by the rules of the western regions. She is not allowed to be presumptuous, but there are some obstacles that cannot be explained clearly. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. What obstacles? Her thigh is thick and her background is strong. Yanqing sighed. She had always been straightforward, but in this world, not everything could go according to her wishes. There were always times when she was constrained. On the day of the accident, there was actually no one present. Her Jiushi went out to play by itself. I don't know how it got into a conflict, but they both said different things. The Begonia Flower Lord said that the Jiushi attacked first, while the Jiushi said that the Begonia Flower Lord had the intention to murder. How can you explain clearly? Little E, the Kun Cultivator Assembly of the 5 Rings is the most taboo of indiscriminate bloodshed, whether it's in or outside the 5 rings. This is the core value of our assembly. You can't follow your own habits. This is why I did not tell you. Even if the 3 Pure Ones Nishang Fairy is at fault, there are rules of the Kun Cultivator Assembly to restrict it. I do not allow you to use weapons and kill without permission. The world of Kun cultivators is different from the normal cultivation world. Chapter 557. Lu Xiaoyi was very innocent. Why would I use weapons? It has nothing to do with me. Senior sister, I'm the most reasonable person and I love peace the most. You know that I hide when I'm in trouble. What a kind person. Gong Xiaodai led the way in front. This is the last Dharma assembly. We won't touch on the Kun Dao, but only on the wonderful Dharma. Everyone will go to the Crabapple Flower King to talk about the Tao heart and reason. We will also give the Flower King an explanation. If we can make it change its mind and let the crabapples bloom at the end of the Dharma assembly, there will be no regrets. Lu Xiaoyi followed behind. Just like when he first came to Xianyuan, he was in the position of a follower. This was his habit, especially when he was traveling with beauties. He liked to follow behind people and feast his eyes. The 2 in front had long been used to this guy's bad taste and could only let him do as he pleased. However, he had an opinion. Isn't it inappropriate for everyone to wipe a person's butt when she does something wrong? Her mount doesn't represent beasts, and she doesn't represent humans either. She's used to such a bad habit. Gong Xiaodai covered her mouth and laughed. Little E, what you mean is that you can wipe a person's butt by yourself? You can wipe it more carefully. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Senior sister Xiaodai knows me best. I'm a professional at wiping a person's butt. Who would know? Gong Xiaodai found it difficult. When one of the 2 people was not serious, she could still cover it up. If 2 of the 3 people were not serious, it would be a disaster. She could only try her best to lead the conversation back to the right track. Of course, it doesn't make sense for everyone to apologize for one person's mistake. However, the principle of the Kun Dao assembly is to never isolate a sister. Therefore, the sisters thought of a flexible method. Everyone will hold a Dharma assembly next to the Crabapple Flower King and discuss the origin of life that plant spirits care about. This is a disguised way to compensate it, and see if it has any effect. It will also make people like you, who don't agree with the collective apology, have nothing to say. Lu Xiaoyi indeed had nothing to say. The Kun cultivators were meticulous, and could always find a way that both sides could accept. However, she was still disdainful. It's such a simple thing. Why do you have to make it so complicated? This was the last day, and it was also the climax that the assembly had deliberately created. The discussion of the Tao regarding the origin of life was in line with the cultivation direction of the majority of Kun cultivators, because it involved aging, substituting, and maintaining youth. This was a hurdle that almost every female cultivator could not avoid. Therefore, although it was also to appease the Crabapple Flower King, there was no trace of any falsehood in his actions. It was very appropriate. Lu Xiaoyi finally saw the begonia flower king. The huge flower vines, stems, and corollas had hundreds of flower bundles, each of which was nearly 10 feet tall. When it was in full bloom, it was unknown how beautiful it was, but now it was tightly closed, as if it had nothing to do with the beauty of the mountains and rivers. Because of the humiliation of the begonia flower king, all the flowers in the mountain river swamp lost their former colors, becoming the failure of the Western region's Kun-Dao conference. Originally, he had no interest in this matter, but after seeing the crabapple flower queen, he had a different feeling. Although the crabapple flower king covered it up very carefully, Lu Xiaoyi had a deeper understanding of some special forms of luck since the interception cluster on the Hassa star had merged with the natural luck and changed its color. He could feel that this crabapple flower king had luck, and because of this, it was able to stand out among the many crabapple banana trees and become the only Jin Dan level crabapple tree in the mountain river swamp. Plant spirits were best at hiding. They were not like beasts that could move freely, avoid risks, and pursue benefits. Therefore, they had their own unique secrets when it came to hiding their aura. This was the main reason why it could survive until now. It had evaded the perception of countless human cultivators, but its secret could not be hidden from Lu Xiaoyi. Before going to the Hassa star, he could not discover it, but now he was different. Since he had discovered it, then he had some guesses about the Mount of Nishang Ferry. In his more than 200 years of cultivation, the first people he came into contact with were human beings with luck, and he did not find any other races. This might also be the reason why his perception was limited. On the Hassa star, he learned that luck could also fall on the spiritual opportunity that had been sealed in the depths of the Earth's core for hundreds of thousands of years. This broadened his vision and made him no longer limited. Now, since he found that the crabapple flower king could also be favored by luck, why couldn't it fall on a demon beast? He was a little interested. It was not that he wanted to steal the luck of these plants and beasts, but he wanted to figure out what kind of role the fragments of luck played in the growth of all creatures. He knew very well that it was impossible for him to collect all the fragments. At that time, when the great way of destiny collapsed, the fragments flew to countless universes. Even if he became a nascent soul or a monarch in his life, he would not be able to go to so many places, let alone steal them. And he might not be able to do it. He just wanted to understand the rules and the forces behind the incident of the Hassa star. The crowd surged, and with the crabapple flower king as the center, they formed a big circle. The preacher preached next to the crabapple flower king, treating it as a master. The cultivators of the Jinsho gardens still attached great importance to this crabapple flower king. This was a strange object in their sphere of influence. It was the plant spirit of the highest realm in the mountains and rivers. It represented a certain significance, so they had been protecting it for thousands of years, in case someone secretly came to dig it up and refine it into elixirs. If it was someone else, if someone destroyed the strange object in their garden, they would be the first to punish them. But it was different now. This was the venue of the Kun-Dao conference. As the masters, they had to protect the purpose of the conference to the greatest extent. Moreover, when the Jiushi and the Flower King were fighting, its master did not participate. Instead, she was talking to other people. In the end, this was just a dispute between plants and animals. It was too much to involve the orthodoxy of human beings. The cultivators took their seats according to their sections. Of course, the seats of the big sects were always better. Those who were in the front row were the few big forces in the western region: Xianyuan, Jialan, Lingord Cave, Wanjing sect, and the master of the Jinshio garden. Among them, there were also many Qian cultivators, which was unavoidable. However, there were no male Foundation establishment cultivators who actually participated. Many of them were led by Jin Dan. Their sects were small and limited, so they could not find Jin Dan cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi was mixed in with the other cultivators. There was nothing strange about his gender. What was strange was his attire. However, since he was from Xianyuan, not many people had any doubts about it. Yenchen said, There are 3 speakers. Master Zanhua Taoist from the Jinxiu Garden, Taoist Mingxiu from Jialan, and Nishang Fairy from the 3 Pure Ones. Listen carefully and don't make trouble. The distribution was very fair. The master of the Jinxiu Garden had to have a place. This had nothing to do with the level of Taoism. Jialan was the most powerful sect in the western region, so it was duty-bound. As for Nishang Fairy, she was the master of the event, so of course she could not hide. Moreover, the 3 Pure Ones' Taoism was outstanding in the 5th ring, so no one doubted it. In this kind of occasion, as usual, Xian Yuan had nothing to do. This was a problem left behind by history. Swordsmen also knew their own limitations. But he was still dissatisfied as usual. I think you should go up, senior sister. Talk to them about the opposite of life. Chapter 558. The lecture soon began. To Lu Xiaoyi's relief, the earth cultivators didn't have the bad habit of beating around the bush and went straight to the point. Taoist Zhang Hua was the first to go on stage to teach. He talked about how the weak could overcome the strong. People are weak when they are born, but they are strong when they die. Plants are weak when they are born, but they wither when they die. Therefore, those who are strong will die, and those who are weak will live. The strong soldiers are destroyed, and the strong trees are broken. The strong are at the bottom, and the weak are at the top. The foundation-building cultivators below were mesmerized by his words, but in Lu Xiaoyi's ears, they were empty. Big but speechless, high but invisible, Taoist Zhang Lan Mingxiu focused more on the temperament. If you don't see, you're clear. If you don't know, you're exposed. If you don't fight, you're meritorious. If you don't boast, you're strong. If you don't fight, you're unrivaled in the world. I have 3 treasures, and I protect them. The first is kindness, the second is frugality, and the third is not daring to be first in the world. Live in a good place, have a good heart, be benevolent, speak well, govern well, do well, and act well at the right time. If you don't fight, you're unrivaled. The state of mind was a very elusive thing for cultivators, and it was rarely mentioned in ordinary sections. It was about self-understanding. Taoist Zhang Lan Mingxiu's words might be in line with the meaning of Tao, but to the swordsman, it was completely inappropriate. After talking for so long, where was the difference? Fortunately, these cheap words were not for the swordsman, but for the Haitang flower master. The last one to go up was Nishang Fairy. This was the first time Lu Xiaoyi saw her. In one word, she was very fairy-like. Why was she fairy-like? In one word, she was light. Of course, you could also understand it as thin. But the thinness of a fairy and the thinness of a mortal who didn't have enough to eat were 2 different concepts. It wasn't that her eyes were sunken and her cheeks were fleshless, but an indescribable feeling of floating, as if a gust of wind could blow her up to the celestial court. His appearance was ethereal, and his voice was ethereal as well. When his words came out of his mouth, his voice descended from the heavens as if it was a celestial voice. This was also a major characteristic of the 3 Pure Ones cultivators when they preached. They were good at creating environments and using astronomical phenomena to increase their persuasiveness. All things under the heavens are of the same nature. Since nature is good, it gives birth to all things. The nature of the earth is good, nourishing all living things, without exception. Saints know the world of music theory and practice the world, so all things are greatly benefited by their merit. Immortalgeman helps the heavens and the earth, but he doesn't dare to take it lightly. He respects it, values it, accepts it, and protects it. Nishang Fairy had been talking all the way, and she had her own style. The 3 Pure Ones cultivators also had another characteristic, which was that they were good at interaction. He would often randomly ask the people who were listening to him to ask and answer. Then, based on the people's answers, he would introduce a deeper level of promotion, making the listeners feel a strong sense of participation. The people he chose were not restricted to one category. There were foundation establishment disciples, Jin Dan fellow cultivators, female cultivators, and strong men. Tao was divided into yin and yang, and it was originally impossible to separate it. How could he be afraid of yin and afraid of yang? His eloquence was really good. Coupled with the cadence of his intonation and the depth of his Tao, he often had a glimmer of hope when he was at a dead end. When he ran out of words, he suddenly had a different peak, which made people addicted. Lu Xiaoyi had experienced the mouth of the three Pure Ones cultivators before. On the Hasa star, there was the gentle, humorous, sincere, and polite Taoist Bai Ti. Behind his admirable demeanor, he just wanted to drag him to hell with him. Of course, Bai Ti was like this, but the fairy was not necessarily like this. Even if it was the tradition of the three Pure Ones, there must be outstanding and independent people among them. He would not prejudge who was a bad person in advance. There was no good or bad in the cultivation world. In the Tao of life, avoid greed and completeness. Perseverance is the nirvana realm. Among the 3,000 weak waters, only one ladle is taken. Among the 10,000 beautiful flowers, only one branch is taken. Fellow cultivator, let me ask you, why only one ladle is taken? Lu Xiaoyi suddenly felt that he was the center of attention. Oh no, it was the center of attention. The fairy Nishang was pointing at him. In theory, it was normal for the speaker to point at anyone, especially those who were in the front row. However, thousands of cultivators listened to the Tao, and there was a very small probability of being pointed at. If you said that it was completely unintentional, you would be deceiving yourself and others. In particular, the Jin Dan cultivators were not pointed at casually. If it was Yuan Ying who was preaching, pointing at them casually was called supporting. If it was Jin Dan who was at the same level as Jin Dan cultivators, there was something inexplicable in it. Considering that the speaker was the three Pure Ones, and the one listening was Xian Yuan, there was a deep meaning in it. Everyone knew that Xian Yuan was good at swordsmanship and fighting, but his knowledge of Tao theory was very limited. He was agile in action, but clumsy in speech. Only Jin Dan, a cultivator from Shanshui Lake, could roughly guess Nishang Fairy's intentions. Since the conflict between Jiu Shi and Haitang Flower Master, a group of cultivators led by Yan Chang and Gong Xiaodai insisted that they should apologize to the Flower Master. This was in line with the Kun Dao Conference's purpose of equality and education. It was their insistence that made the cultivators around Nishang Fairy have no choice but to agree to the last speech for Haitang Flower Master. Factional undercurrents existed everywhere. Even the cultivators who were detached from worldly affairs were no exception. It was just that their circle was more gentle and not as direct and bloody as the outside world. Nishang Fairy, who originally didn't want to preach at the conference, had the idea of disgusting Xian Yuan. She wasn't tired of preaching, but she hated being forced to do so. In her opinion, it wasn't her fault. It was just a dispute between the two of them, and it didn't cause irreparable results. Why did it have to be like this? There were deaths and injuries and fights between human cultivators, but they weren't so fragile and spoiled. Lu Xiaoyi didn't know this. Yan Chang was afraid that he would cause trouble, so she didn't mention it to him. Although he didn't know the truth, it didn't mean that he didn't understand the contempt in Nishang Fairy's words. This was the simplest and most basic principle of Taoism. Everyone knew it, and there was no other answer. Not to mention the Jindan stage, even the qi-eating cultivators who had just entered the path of Taoism and even the mortals who had read some books could understand it. She didn't want to cause trouble for him, but he still wanted to flirt with her. Lu Xiaoyi didn't fall for her tricks. Only taking a ladle of drink, probably because you don't have a wooden bucket? Yan Chang and Gong Xiaodai smiled. This person was good at fighting, but he couldn't learn Taoism. However, bickering and pestering were his natural skills. Only taking a ladle of drink, probably because you only have a wooden ladle. A man only marries one wife, and the only reason is that he doesn't have the money to marry a second one. A woman longs for eternal youth. She wants to be 20 this year and 18 the next year. Where is the end of her desire? However, she is forced by the environment, limited by her strength, and hindered by her opportunities. The three Pure Ones have a lot of business, and their disciples have countless buckets and jars. However, they teach others to use a wooden ladle. This is too much. Lu Xiaoyu was talking nonsense here, but he didn't show any pity for the hickory staff fairy's cold face. This was also why Xiao Dai of the Misty Cloud Palace was most satisfied with him. He didn't show any emotion, but when he turned hostile, he would bite whoever he caught. He didn't care about whether they were fairies or not. Chapter 559. In most spiritual gatherings, the most exciting thing would be the confrontation between two cultivators. This was especially true for sects that were evenly matched. Either sparks of thought would fly, or blood would splatter from their bodies. It was very exciting. Nishong Fairy was prepared for this, but she was not affected by his pestering. She hated sword cultivator Xuanyuan's righteous conduct, which made her a little uncomfortable on this leisure trip. She didn't come for the Kuan Dao convention in the western region. She just happened to be there at the right time and rushed to this point. The Jiu sure was a bit abnormal, but she didn't have time to ask. This beast had been with her for hundreds of years. She had raised it since it was a child, so she knew its temper like the back of her hand. Although it looked ferocious, its temper was actually not that bad. There must be a special reason that she didn't know. Otherwise, the Jiu sure had never been abnormal, unless it had hurt someone in a battle. Therefore, she insisted that this dispute was the fault of the Haitang flower owner, not her beast. People liked the beauty of flowers and hated the ugliness of ferocious beasts. But they didn't know that beauty and ugliness meant nothing. At least she knew that many plant spirits dressed themselves up like little white flowers, but in fact, there were a lot of them that ate people's flesh and blood. For any creature, once they started to practice, how could they be kind? If they were kind, they wouldn't have lived until now. Pestering endlessly. I use Taoism to explain and let bygones be bygones. In your eyes, I am fishing for fame. Is this unnecessary? Xian Yuan prioritizes fighting everywhere. He doesn't pity the weak and doesn't hold tolerance. Does this mean that he has a different opinion about the Haitang flower? Lu Xiai smiled. I am just stating facts. In fact, it is useless for you to say so much. You just want to persuade others to be tolerant. Others bear with it, but you don't take responsibility. You let the emperor do as he pleases, and you still have a high position in righteousness. Is this the way of the three pure ones? Nishong Fairy changed the topic. Right and wrong are in people's hearts, and Taoism always exists. I won't argue with you. Since Xian Yuan is famous in the Five Rings for his agility, why don't we make a small bet? Let's bet on the blooming of the Haitang flower. Whoever makes it bloom wins. Do you dare? This was the true meaning of Nishong Fairy. Defeating a Xian Yuan swordsman in a Dao debate was meaningless. In the past tens of thousands of years, the Xian Yuan people had never won more than a few debates against the law lineage. This kind of weakling only made people feel that they had an unfair advantage. If he wanted to humiliate Xian Yuan, he had to start with his actions. He had to start with Xuanyuan's swordsman's most prided skill, nimble yushing. Of course, it was not a fight. It was a matter of fact. It was on this crabapple flower. Why didn't she look for Yan Cheng and Gong Xiaodai? Of the two female swordsmen, one was bold and careful, while the other was beautiful and intelligent. Neither of them would fall for her trick. This was what she felt after interacting with them for dozens of days at the conference. Originally, she had already given up on the idea of making Xian Yuan lose face at the conference. But who would have thought that Xian Yuan would actually send a Jing Dan Xian Xiu? Who didn't know that Xian Yuan people were bellicose and couldn't stand provocation? The female cultivator was careful and restrained herself at the Kuan Dao conference. However, since such a reckless guy had broken in, wasn't he the best target for her to provoke? She wasn't afraid of the consequences. It wasn't a martial arts competition, and it didn't involve life and death. Under the watchful eyes of the public, it was just a matter of losing face. This had long become a habit in the tens of thousands of years of tit-for-tat confrontation between the two sides. Now it seemed that this swordsman really had a rash temper. With a little provocation, he immediately fell for the trap. Now that she had made a bet, whether he accepted or not, he would lose face. How could it be good? If he didn't accept, it would weaken his momentum. The dignified Xianyuan swordsman didn't even have the courage to accept the challenge. If he accepted, with the swordsman's ability, it would be easy for them to destroy the crabapple flower master. However, it would be impossible for them to persuade the crabapple flower to bloom. Yan Cheng and Gong Xiaodai immediately reacted. This woman from the three pure ones was too vicious. At first, the two of them didn't think too much about it. In the end, she forced that idiot little E into a dilemma with just one sentence. The key was that they didn't have any other good way to deal with it. However, Lu Xiaoyi didn't seem to realize it. It was as if he didn't realize his awkward situation at all. A bet? I, Xianyuan, have never shown weakness to anyone. Why would I be afraid of you? However, now that we have a bet, how do we calculate the stakes? How about if the fairy loses, she has to be my mistress? And if I lose, I have to be the fairy's gigolo? Seeing that he couldn't hear the sinister intentions of this scorpion fairy, he was still arguing about some minor details and taking advantage of her words. He was too childish. However, no matter how much Yanqing and Gong Xiaodai reminded him with their divine senses, this guy was stubborn and stubborn. Beside them, buried flower Taoist interrupted. She was the master here, and it was a headache for her to see two rivals making trouble in her own territory. She couldn't tell who was the one who was the victim. Yanqing and Gong Xiaodai had taken the lead to find out the whole story first, and the Nikhang Spiritual Assembly had counterattacked after. One was the overlord of the western region, and the other was the pillar of the Dharma branch. It was difficult to determine who the splendid embroidery should help, but there was one thing she couldn't do. This was her principle. How about this? Everyone here is a guest, and we are all here for the meaning of the Great Way. Why don't the splendid embroidery pay the stakes? Although this crabapple banana isn't a special species, it's still very rare after 1,000 years of cultivation. It'll be good to transplant it into the herb garden. How about this? If either of you can persuade the crabapple flower master to bloom, I'll give him or her the crabapple flower master. It'll be a good story. Nishang Fairy knew that her master was secretly helping her, so she said, "You're right. Since I'm the one who proposed the bet, why don't you try it first?" Lu Xiaoyi hesitated. "You're very confident." "Don't tell me." Nikhang sneered. "That's my business. You should worry about yourself first." Lu Xiaoyi made his decision. "Okay. I'll bet. But since it's a conflict between the crabapple flower master and the Geo Lion, I hope you can give me your Geo Lion for the time being. I'll be able to mediate between them." Nikhang Fairy was very generous. "Why not?" With a flip of his hand, a ferocious and ugly Geo Lion appeared from the spirit beast pouch. Its body was huge and several dozen feet long. It looked majestic and murderous, but as long as a cultivator looked carefully, they would be able to see a trace of panic in its eyes. Lu Xiaoyi didn't avoid it. He reached out and grabbed the Geo Lion's mane, which wanted to hide but didn't dare to. He pulled it toward the crabapple flower master. There were many types of demonic beasts. There were wild ones, domesticated ones, fighting ones, subsidized ones, flying ones, and pets. There were countless of them. Among them, the most ferocious ones were the wild fighting demonic beasts, and so on. For example, the Geo Lion was raised by the family since it was young and was used as a flying mount. Its combat ability was limited and it might only be slightly stronger than a pet beast. Therefore, the so-called gene and stage cultivation was just to scare people. In the cultivation world, it was a principle that almost all demonic beasts in the same realm were weaker than humans, except for a few ancient sacred beasts at the top of the food chain. This was also the reason why Lu Xiaoyi dared to carelessly stroke the Geo Lion's whiskers. Chapter 560. Thousands of pairs of eyes stared at him, not knowing how the situation would develop. If it was a battle, no one would think that the swordsman would lose. However, if it was to make the crabapple flower bloom, no one would think that he would win. This was because in the past 10 days, countless cultivators had already used up all their methods. They were not good at killing people, but when it came to such unorthodox ways, to flowers and plants, they believed that no one could compare with them. There was only one conclusion, that the swordsman's brain was flooded with water. Lu Xiaoyi did not care about what others thought. He was very grateful that he was able to pretend to be second-rate before leaving the fifth ring. He was grateful that the three pure ones had given him such a rare opportunity. Under normal circumstances, it would not be easy to catch the three pure ones in public. He led the unwilling Jiushi to the side of the crabapple flower lord. He did not care about the crabapple flower lord who was ignoring him. He grabbed the Jiushi's front paw with one hand and the thickest stem of the crabapple flower with the other. Under the gaze of thousands of people, he began to chant. You clap once, I clap once, a child wearing flowery clothes. This was a nursery rhyme? Even the most imaginative cultivator would not be able to imagine that he would use a nursery rhyme to communicate with two Jin Dan demons. But what they didn't know was that Lu Xiaoyi's fate-intercepting cluster was quietly revolving in his sea of consciousness, suddenly grabbing onto the Jiushi and Haitang flower mistress fate-intercepting cluster. This immediately caused the two monsters to be extremely terrified. Unfortunately, Lu Xiaoyi had grabbed onto their vital points. Their Fa was taken, their bloodline was taken, and the most frightening thing was that their fate-intercepting cluster could be taken at any time. This caused them to not dare to act blindly without thinking. In their sea of consciousness, another sentence was transmitted. It was not a nursery rhyme. I'll speak, you listen. If you say no, I will destroy your body and soul. The two demons did not dare to act rashly as they felt that this human was extremely dangerous. Under the gaze of thousands of people, they could also feel that this person did not hide his killing intent. You clap twice, I clap twice, two children braid their hair. It's all for fate. Don't tell me who's right and who's wrong, I don't want to hear it. You're lucky to have met me, so I won't covet your luck. But even if I don't care, it doesn't mean that I won't do it. Especially when I'm unhappy, even if it's useless, I'll still take it. Thousands of cultivators looked at him as if they were looking at an idiot. Listening to the strange and tuneless nursery rhyme that he was reciting, they felt that the world of cultivation had become unreal. How could a lunatic marry a Jin Dan? You take 3 shots, I'll take 3 shots. The 3 kids are going to climb the mountain. Jiushi, apologize to Haitang. Haitang, immediately bloom all the Haitang flowers in this Shanshui swamp. Since I lost the bet, I'll start with the 2 of you. Even if I can't kill you on the spot, I'll take away your luck so that you won't be able to reach the upper realm for the rest of your life. What happened next shocked everyone. The swordsman had only reached the 3rd verse of his absurd nursery rhyme when the Haitang flower owner's tightly closed flower bun suddenly opened. Then, all the flower bun on the entire tree bloomed at the same time. Following that, all the Haitang bananas in the Shanshui swamp bloomed in the swamp as if they had sensed some kind of mystery. The color of the Shanshui swamp changed, and the expressions of countless cultivators changed. How did he do it? It didn't make sense. Apart from the sword, the swordsman also had such a mysterious ability? Almost everyone was stunned on the spot, including Gong Xiaodai, Nick Hang, Flower Burial, Mingxiu, and the rest of the Jin Dan. The entire scene was under their perception. There were no ripples of mana or mental energy. The only ripples were the nursery rhyme. Lu Xiaoyi raised his head and smiled. I've won! Are the Haitang flowers mine now? Flower Burial Fairy felt her heart ache. But no matter how much it hurt, she could not hesitate in front of thousands of people. She could only bear the pain and give up her treasure. Fellow Taoist has won. The Haitang flower owner is yours. Whether it lives or dies, it's all up to you. Good! Lu Xiaoyi laughed loudly. As he laughed, Sword Chi suddenly surged out from the hand holding the Hai Tang flower owner. It was not only Sword Chi that rushed in, but also a few hungry sword spirits. In the blink of an eye, the Hai Tang flower owner could not even make a sound, let alone resist. She had already been turned into ashes by the Sword Chi. This scene caused the hearts of the earth cultivators present to tremble violently. They had already been tormented by this tossing and turning to the point that they had lost their ability to judge. Madman. A real madman. The Jiushi, who was still being held by the front paw, was almost limp on the ground. It did not know if it would be the next one. Compared to the Hai Tang flower owner, its attack might be stronger, but its defense was not as good. How could it withstand a casual attack from this savage? You! Flower Burial Fairy was furious. She didn't expect that the swordsman would dare to lay his hands on her in the next moment, while she was still ringing in her ears. However, she could not say anything because she had already given the Hai Tang flower owner away. It no longer belonged to Splendid, but to the swordsman. Did the swordsman need to ask for her opinion on how to deal with his own things? At most, he did not care about the occasion and ruined everyone's mood. At this moment, Lu Xiaoyi's tone changed. He casually struck the Hai Tang flower owner's roots, creating a big hole. This humble Taoist actions are not casual and bloodthirsty. Come and take a look. Under his signal, countless cultivators' divine senses rushed to the bottom of the hole. There were piles of bones buried there, old and new. Lu Xiaoyi's voice sounded again. Recently, no cultivators have gone missing in the mountain river swamp? The cultivators were in an uproar, especially the small sects around Splendid Garden. In the past 200 years, there were always disciples who went missing. No one knew where they went, and no one could find them. It was impossible for all of them to be here, but some of them must be here. There were some cultivators that rushed over and began to search through the white bones. Even though they had lost the cover of Crabapple Flower Master, they were still able to find traces of their former disciples from the white bones. Moreover, he immediately made a discovery among the new bones. The scene was chaotic. The preaching conference turned into a funeral, a grievance conference, and a recital conference. The cultivators of Splendid Garden were miserable. After all, before the Hai Tang flower owner was sent away, it had always belonged to Splendid Garden. Then, shouldn't Splendid Garden take some responsibility for committing such a great crime against humanity? In the chaos, Lu Xiaoyi pulled the Jiushi away and asked through the communication of fate. If I can't make the Hai Tang flower bloom, do you know what method your master will use to make the sea of flowers reappear? The Jiushi finally calmed down. It was unwilling to face such a question, but in front of this savage, it could not pretend to be deaf and dumb. I know! I know! As a mount, I am my master's meat shield in times of danger. Life and death, I know! Chapter 561. I've avenged you and cleared your name. I won't take away your fate, and I won't easily reveal your secrets to others. All of this might be for the small help I might need in a few decades or centuries. Are you willing to accept it? With Jiushi's current state of mind, how could he withstand such pressure? Even his master's dignity couldn't be compared to this vicious person's despotic power. As long as you don't harm my master's life, I'm willing to help you. Deal! Lu Xiaoyi smiled happily. The World Qundao Conference in the Western regions finally ended after a few months. It was hard to say whether it was a success or not. At the end of the conference, the blooming of the crabapple flowers added color to the closing ceremony. However, the swordsman's superfluous actions added another variable to the conference. Under the crabapple tree, more than 10 cultivators' corpses cast a shadow over the peaceful Splendid Garden. This made many people unhappy. On a large flying boat, more than 100 Xianyuan swordsmen were sitting neatly. They seemed to be closing their eyes and concentrating, but all of their ears were perked up. From time to time, they would sweep their gazes across the 3 figures in front of the boat. They keenly discovered that Martial Ant Yenqing was on the left, Martial Ant Gong Xiaodai was on the right, and the mysterious Jean Dan in the straw hat was in the middle. Then, who exactly was this person? Although the number of Jean Dan in the dome was not as terrifying as the number of Foundation establishment cultivators, there were still 2,000 or 3,000 of them. Among them, there were countless outstanding ones. Because they didn't use their swords, it was impossible to distinguish them. Why did you have to kill the crabapple flower master on the spot? Xiaoyi, you must have discovered something, so you acted so ruthlessly. Why didn't you wait until the conference was over? You could have done it in private. Splendid Garden would never protect such a sinister monster. This was the same question that Yenqing and Gong Xiaodai had. Lu Xiaoyi had done a good job at the beginning, resolving the matter by singing a nursery rhyme. However, the final massacre was completely unnecessary, and it only made the Xianyuan even more crazy. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. This pretense was over, but it would be troublesome to explain it clearly. Fortunately, the 2 senior sisters beside him were on his side and wouldn't ask too much. Do you think that I attacked the reputation of the 3 pure ones at the Kuandao meeting? The 2 of them fell into deep thought. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head and continued. No! There was no need to attack the 3 pure ones anymore. Tens of thousands of years of grudges, it is not something that can be decided by a small bet. I want to teach Splendid Garden a lesson. This sect was located in the western regions, but it had secret dealings with the 3 clear ones, and catered to them in every way possible. Not only did the 3 clear ones' disciples come in and out, but they were also very cooperative in their actions. This could be seen very clearly in the case of the Haitang Flower Master. The problem of the 3 pure ones is not a problem that can be solved in a short time, and it is also not a problem that can be eradicated at our level. However, since Splendid Garden was so brazen in the western regions, I think we need to teach them how to behave. They can't ignore the overall strategy of the Xianyuan in the western regions just because they are a force of Kun cultivators. In Irai, even a powerful swordsman force like the Wei Sword Mountain had a difficult time under the siege of the 3 pure ones. All the forces that are on good terms with the sword vein have a difficult time. Incidents occur one after another. For example, the Kun-Dao separation boundary is almost always provoked by the surrounding forces. I have personally participated in it once, but it was just one of countless times. If you go there at any time, there will be trouble at any time. Then, why can the forces that are on good terms with the 3 pure ones live a good life in the western regions? This is the reason why I killed the Haitang Flower Master in public. It is because I want to tell her in front of everyone that Splendid Garden is humiliating her. Because they are wrong friends. Gong Xiaodai nodded. Xiaoyi is right. I will report your thoughts to the Thunderbolt Palace. For a sect like this, the pressure must be constant. We have to let them know the pain, and it must be endless pain. Yenqing did not object. The sect is indeed negligent in this aspect. We only pay attention to the big picture, like the myriad scenery sect. We are too lenient towards these small sects with their own characteristics. I will. Shouldn't you report this matter to the Rising Heaven Pavilion yourself, Xiaoyi? Lu Xiaoyi was indignant. Why should I report it? I have already been exiled. My relationship is about to be transferred away. I am not in my position, I am not involved in politics. What happens to the western regions has nothing to do with me. Yenqing did not like to hear this. Xiaoyi, how is this exiled? In my eyes, if you give me such a chance, I will be more than happy. Let me tell you, although the Blue Sky Realm is not as big as the 5 rings, and may be a little inferior in terms of spiritual opportunity, it is still a superior cultivation boundary in the universe. It is a pure human cultivation environment. In its distant history, there was once a boundary of immortals. It is the holy land of the swordsman, and this will never change. Lu Xiaoyi raised his hand and begged for mercy. Okay, I will not be exiled, I will go to the Holy Land to further my studies. When I come back, I will be promoted by 3 ranks and will be greatly valued. I will become a strong candidate for the leadership of the Rising Heaven Pavilion. But you have to be careful, the abnormality of the crabapple flower lord cannot be ruled out as a man-made cause. Splendid is the biggest suspect here. But it is also a dead end. If I did not kill it, and insisted on finding the truth, it would push Splendid to the 3 pure ones. This is not the way to go. So I killed it. It is to leave room for you to maneuver. The final result, whether it is flat or round, will depend on you. I do not have time, and I am too lazy to waste my time on flowers and plants. Gong Xiaodie's bright eyes turned. Xiaoyi, you have a lot of secrets. We will not ask you what it is, but the next time you use your ability, it is not good to do it in public. It is better to restrain yourself. In the cultivation world, there are many people with ulterior motives. What you did today, someone may secretly remember it and cause trouble for you in the future. Yan Cheng agreed. Senior Marshal Sister is right. Xiaoyi, I'll be frank with you. You need to change your pretentious character. Lu Xiaoyi spread out his hands. I did not want to do it, but who asked that hickory pole fairy to choose me? She probably could not afford to offend the 2 of you, so she found a meat chicken like me. Actually, I was thinking that since I will be away from the 5th ring for a long time, I might as well have a good time. Lu Xiaoyi did not accompany them all the time, because this team of Kun cultivators had other itineraries besides participating in the Kun Dao convention. They had to communicate with a few sects that they were on good terms with. Of course, they had to go to enough places to be efficient. This was also the reason why he specially came to find Yanqing. If he really waited at the dome, it was very likely that he would not be able to see her. I am leaving. Lu Xiaoyi played it down. Although he might be gone for hundreds of years, it was hard to say whether there would be such a reunion when he returned. Live well. I do not want to be the only child of a lower 3 stars. Gong Xiaodai was still calm. Stop pretending. Stop showing off. Yan Chen was much more direct. She understood this guy better and knew that behind his fear of trouble, there was actually a crazy heart. Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand and disappeared, leaving the 2 women there quietly looking at each other. Of course, there was also the surprise and gossip on the flying boat. There was no need to talk about Yanqing. Thousand Xiufeng was famous for her cold personality, and no one had heard of her having any connection with other Qian cultivators. Gong Xiaodai was the same. She was beautiful and enchanting, but she was famous for being ruthless and scheming in the Inner Sword sect. She was no longer a rose with thorns, but a snake and scorpion beauty. Who was the person that these 2 outstanding women were paying attention to? Chapter 562. Lu Xiaoyi slowly began to fly back. There was not much time left. What happened in the mountain river swamp had a great impact on him. His attitude did not prejudge any matter to be good or bad. Because the interception of luck had now merged with nature's luck, he had a good impression of nature creatures. This was also his usual attitude. Before approaching the crabapple flower master, he began to have doubts. This was because the cooperation shown by the hemp pole fairy's mount during the whole process did not match its ferocious and ugly appearance. If it were any other demonic beast that had not yet lost its wild nature, being controlled by a stranger, especially an unfamiliar enemy, would make them feel uneasy. Even if this was agreed by its master, in its subconscious, there would be a rejection from the bottom of its heart. But he could not feel it. Through contact, through the resonance of luck, he could accurately distinguish the inner emotional fluctuations of the Jiushi. But in the consciousness of this outwardly strong but inwardly weak Jiushi, he did not feel any consciousness of resistance. There could only be one conclusion. This Jiushi's temperament was weak. It could be innate, or it could be the result of long-term domestic rearing. Or it could be the combination of all these factors. This was probably the reason why it could only be a mount, and also the reason why the hemp pole fairy insisted that it was not her mount that provoked it first. This was not strange. The dragon had 9 sons, and each one was different. If the dragon was like this, then what about the geoshur whose bloodline was countless times weaker? When he grabbed the stem of the crabapple flower master and absorbed the interception of luck, everything was clear. This crabapple flower master looked incomparably beautiful, but in fact, the things it did behind the scenes were incomparably bloody. It usually hid itself deeply, and only showed its admirable beauty and low cultivation realm. It lured those foreign cultivators who did not know its background to approach, and then suddenly attacked. The specific cause and process was hard to say. Was it before or after it obtained the luck? Did the crabapple flower master have evil intentions? Or did the human cultivators have evil thoughts of plucking it? But one thing was very clear. The crabapple flower master had now become an out-and-out murderous evil spirit. Under its beautiful appearance, there were hidden fangs. Its bloody nature met the cowardly geoshur, and it discovered the rare power of luck in the geoshur's body. How could it bear such a temptation? Thus, there was a conflict. However, it had a small belly and was unable to swallow the geoshur. It did not expect that although the geoshur was weak, it would display an explosive strength when its life was threatened. It was a little helpless. The reason why the crabapple flower lord did not bloom and caused all the crabapple flowers in the mountain and spring swamp to close themselves off was not because they had been wronged and wanted to be compensated. It was a sign of weakness in front of the geoshur. This was how they communicated with each other. The general meaning was, "I admit defeat, please don't expose everything." He didn't know what the geoshur was thinking, but it was clear that the geoshur didn't have a strong will and didn't tell its master the truth. Perhaps it didn't know what to say. This was a matter of fate, and no creature was willing to reveal this secret. This was also what the Haitang flower master believed. It believed that the geoshur would not reveal their secret. At the same time, it used the mountain and spring swamp's crabapple flowers to express its apology. It wanted to avoid the attention of humans. If it wasn't for Lu Xiaoyi, it would have succeeded. At the level of Jin Dan, almost every creature with fate had a way to hide their own fate. Lu Xiaoyi was not the only smart person. Anyone with a little bit of intelligence would do everything possible to hide their fate. This was the key to survival. Lu Xiaoyi destroyed all of this. He liked nature, but it did not mean that he would tolerate everything. His thinking was simple. Humans should respect nature, and similarly, nature should respect humans. He did not attack the geoshur and kill the crabapple flower master because it was his. However, the geoshur was handed over to him by the hickory staff fairy. According to the rules of the cultivation world, under such circumstances, he could not attack. Even if it was a demonic beast of the 3 pure ones, this was the basic principle of a cultivator. Moreover, the geoshur's behavior made him see a possibility. A possibility of planting a spy in the 3 pure ones. He did not have the ability to control humans at the moment. Humans were the most complicated creatures. If he did not control them well, he would be devoured. However, demonic beasts were different. He gave the geoshur face and helped it take revenge. He also had the same secret as the geoshur. The most important thing was that the geoshur had a weak personality. He could not use it now, and he might not use it in the future. This was a trap planted in advance. With the relationship between the Xianyuan and the 3 pure ones, who knew what would happen in the future? Nothing happened on the way back. He wobbled back to the dome, and was immediately summoned by Immortal Rui. The Immortal Rui frowned. "The departure date is near. You still have time to go sightseeing and looking for women?" Lu Xiaoyi did not argue. "I was thinking that since it is impossible to prepare everything, I might as well go there and think of a way." Immortal Rui scolded. "Ridiculous! You know that you can't prepare everything, so you don't prepare anything? Why don't you know that you can't cultivate anymore?" You know that it is useless to work hard, so you don't work hard? You know that you are going to die, So you don't want to live anymore? Do your best and leave the rest to heaven's will. This is the style of cultivators of my generation. Do you want to go there and look for other sects to take advantage of and dine and dash? Lu Xiaoyi laughed mischievously. Martial uncle, there will always be a big family with a big business. Immortal Rui snorted. Cigarette, but let me warn you. Don't underestimate the complexity of Clear Sky. Because of the disparity in overall strength, the 3 pure ones left behind in Clear Sky is much stronger than Xianyuan. We can maintain an equal footing with the 3 pure ones in the 5th ring. However, in Zhuizhou, the Supreme and the 3 pure ones still left behind a strong force. This is the foundation of the Dharma lineage. However, we are unable to maintain a strong position in both aspects. Xianyuan chose to be aggressive in the 5th ring because there are unlimited opportunities and more stages here. It is also because of this that we chose to be defensive in a peaceful place like Clear Sky. This is the main premise. Don't get it mixed up. Do you think you can swagger around like you did in the 5th ring and do whatever you want? Lu Xie sighed. Sure enough, it was not a good place. Senior Martial Sister said it was a holy land. Was this the situation of a holy land? I am just a brick. I will move wherever I am needed. Immortal Rui softened his tone. In fact, he did not approve of sending Cigarette but back to Clear Sky. There were many suitable candidates in the inner sword. They were strong and experienced. The crushing strength that Cigarette but displayed when he was in the Foundation establishment realm was something that Jean Dan could not achieve. He had potential, but potential needed time to transform into strength. He had formed his gold core less than 40 years ago. In Jean Dan's 700 to 800 years of life, it was still too short. Immortal Rui thought that even if this kid had a lot of potential, he still needed 100 or 200 years to grow. It was a bit excessive. However, this was the opinion of the monarchs. Immortal Rui's objection was meaningless. Chapter 563. He threw over a jade talisman. With this talisman, you can go to the inner and outer storage of Thousand Shio Peak to collect some necessary materials. This is the support of the sect for you. Considering the mess you made on planet Hassa, this treatment is already beyond the law. You should be content. Lu Xiaoyi asked the question he was most concerned about. Martial uncle, what exactly am I going to do there? Can you give me a specific structure? Immortal Rui's answer was very vague. I can't explain anything to you now. Because it's too far away, I can't predict the situation in the other universe. When you go to Blue Sky, the Immortals and Supreme Immortals there will naturally take over. Just listen to their orders. They are the only ones who know the specific situation best. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. Martial uncle, are you familiar with them? Immortal Rui laughed. Familiar? How can I not be familiar with them? The Rising Heaven Pavilion there, and the Rising Heaven Pavilion here are interchangeable. Do you still remember the immortal Chung who brought you to the 5th ring? He is now in Blue Sky. I don't know if he still remembers you. In the next 3 months, Lu Xiaoyi put all his energy into preparing various materials that he might need in the future direction of his cultivation. This also included the selection of various cultivation techniques in Boa Tower. He went through them again. Among them, he especially learned about the Blue Sky world. Fortunately, there were a lot of books about it. This was the ancestral land. Even if he hadn't set foot on that land, he could still have a deep understanding of it. This was a really deep understanding of it, including the countless secrets that had been hidden for tens of thousands of years. The more he read, the more he found it interesting. There was a gap that happened 11,000 years ago. Originally, Blue Sky had become a star area that was about to be abandoned. However, later on, it inexplicably recovered its status. The reason was the same as planet Hassa's revival of spiritual opportunity. However, the complexity behind it was not as simple as it seemed on paper. The news of him going to Blue Sky was not a secret of the sect, so there was no need to keep it a secret. He didn't intend to hide it from his closest friends. In fact, the route between the fifth ring and the left circle was the busiest route. Not only Xianyuan, but almost all the big and small sects had a very close and fixed connection with their home planet. Xianyuan was far from frequent. For example, the Supreme Three Purity Temple would send a large floating raft back and forth on this route every 3 years. Xianyuan Sword Sect's fixed frequency was once every 5 years. Even if it was by the antimatter space, it would take almost 5 years. That was to say, for sects like the Three Purity Temple, they would have 2 floating rafts of the route at the same time most of the time. For sects like the Three Purity, they would have 2 floating rafts at the same time most of the time, not including the ones from the opposite side. Lu Xiaoyi was about to take a fixed flight from Xianyuan. It carried both people and goods. In most cases, they would carry goods from the fifth ring to the left circle, and carry people from the left circle back to the fifth ring. This was the tacit understanding of all the top sections. Even if the spiritium of the fifth ring was enough to last for hundreds of thousands of years, what would affect its survival would not be the spiritium, but other sudden changes. The big sects were well aware of this. Therefore, transporting core cultivator resources back to the home planet was a shady business that everyone was doing. Transporting the resources back and sealing them up, just in case. Then, they would transport more cultivators and throw them into the vigorous universe plundering. This was the typical bandit logic of the mortal world. The bandits would transport the precious treasures they had plundered back to their mountain, while they themselves would live a carefree life outside. When their children grew up, they would follow their elders into battle, forming a virtuous cycle. The problem now was that there were some disputes between the big and small bandits in the mountain. Therefore, the bandit group that was out hunting sent a fighter back. Regarding the blue sky swordsman who stayed behind to guard Xianyuan, he originally did not have the qualifications to obtain this information. He had to at least be in Yuanying, and he had to be a powerful person in Yuanying to know this information. However, since he was about to head to Blue Sky, there were some things that he did not need to hide from him. Only then did he know some things about Blue Sky's home. In Blue Sky, the most powerful people were perfected cultivators. Adding up all the perfected cultivators in Xuanyuan's sword faction, 30% of them stayed in Blue Sky. They took turns guarding it. For example, all the perfected cultivators that Lu Xiaoyi had come into contact with had stayed in Blue Sky for at least a few hundred years, and at most a few thousand years. Just from this point alone, it could be seen that Xianyuan valued their homes so much that outsiders could not imagine. Of course, it was the same for the other top sections. The safety of their lair did not depend on their past reputation, but on their actual strength. Only true monarchs, who were the top cultivators, could truly ensure the safety of a sect and a domain. Only then could they deal with the endless troubles that came from the universe. The allocation of perfected cultivators was far worse. Of all the Yuanying perfected cultivators in Xianyuan, less than 10% remained in Blue Sky. There was no way to look further down. Even a foundation establishment cultivator with some potential like Yenqin would be sent to the fifth ring on the floating raft once every 5 years. It was easy to imagine what kind of people were left behind. The upper realm of swordsmen was originally more difficult than Dharma cultivator, and after sending away the elites with potential, the success rate of the remaining people was so low that it made one's hair stand on end. Occasionally, there would be those who were lucky enough to succeed, but as long as they had a dream, they would request to go to the fifth ring, the melting pot. Those who stayed behind were few and far between. From the composition, it could be clearly seen that Xuanyuan's strategic attitude towards their home was that the two sides were big, and the middle was small. It was extremely unbalanced. The two sides referred to the perfected cultivators who were the strongest, and they were the ultimate power that ensured the safety of Mount E. The other side was the cultivation system of the mortal world, and it was basically foundation establishment cultivators with average aptitude who were in charge of this kind of work. But in the middle, the elites were basically all in the fifth ring. There was a bigger stage, more opportunities, and closer to the atmosphere of the war in the universe. It was something that the blue sky world, which was far away in a corner, could not compare to. In fact, this was also the strategic arrangement that most of the fifth ring powers had in their home. It could cultivate the most outstanding juniors to the greatest extent and ensure the safety of their home. Their defensive capabilities towards the direction of the universe were very strong, and they attached great importance to the cultivation system in the mortal world. The only flaw was that they lacked the middle, and they lacked the ability to control the changes within the domain. If the blue sky world only had Xianyuan, the three pure ones, and the Tai family, it would not have mattered. After all, everyone had the same strategy, and it did not matter if there were fewer people in the middle. But the problem was that there were other powers that did not place their focus on the fifth ring, but on their home, the blue sky world. Moreover, in the blue sky world, there were some powers and sects that could not leave the universe at all. They had to, and had no choice but to, put all their energy into the blue sky world. The sum of these powers, after 10,000 years of growth, naturally gave birth to some strange things. It was not that they wanted to pull down an overlord like Xianyuan, but they wanted to take a bite out of the cultivation of the domain, occupy more territory, and pull out a few strands of the overlord's hair when it dozed off. This was the situation. Chapter 564. Time passed in a flash. During this period, Lu Xiaoyi still had two unfinished business. The first was the whereabouts of Han Yan. If he was still in the fifth ring, he would not be in a hurry to find him. If fate brought them together, they would eventually meet. However, if he went to the blue sky sect and did not return for hundreds of years, then he had to at least give himself a reason to calm down. Through the sect's teleportation array, he was teleported to Weijian Mountain. Then, he went to the Kun Daoli world in a low-key manner. He was timid the entire time until he returned to the mountain. On Fangting Island, he did not receive any surprises. The Kun Dao masters did not seem to have any reason to hide it from him. After harvesting an entire storage ring of candied haws, he could only return dejectedly. Han Yan had gone to an unknown place. This was the Kun Dao master's explanation. Looking at their apologetic gazes, he knew that he could not ask for too much. In the cultivation world, the most taboo was to force. He had his reasons, and others had their difficulties. Then, he would leave it to time. The second thing was, Master Gio, I'm going to the Blue Sky sect. Do you have any instructions? Or do you have any old friends that you need to send a message to? Standing in the small courtyard of the farmhouse, Lu Xiaoyi brought Master Gio's favorite food. A Jew appeared in the small courtyard with a big belly and looked at Lu Xiaoyi. Oh, Jean Dan! But your speed is a little slow. Go to the Blue Sky sect? Good place. It's also Master Gio's hometown, but I can't go with you because that damn heavy. Who should I send a letter to? Let me think, there doesn't seem to be anyone who can live for more than 10,000 years. No, there are a few, but you can't see them for the time being. There's a boat, a tower, and a tree. I don't know if they're still there. Good place, that's where the dream began. A Jew muttered as he stuffed his mouth with food. A rare memory appeared in his eyes. Lu Xiaoyi did not ask further. What damn heavy? What boat, tower, tree? He knew that with his cultivation level, knowing these things would be asking for trouble, so he might as well not ask. He had enough troubles of his own. Master Gio, do you have any instructions? Aju shook her head. She realized that she really could not help the human race at all. Those things that she thought were amazing were not attractive to this kid at all. This made it very sad. However, this was also good. Only in this way would he not walk down the same path. Only then would there be greater possibilities and a wider space. As a senior, as someone who had been through this before, it only needed to watch. Watching others grow up was also a very blissful thing. Of course, he had to remind them of what he needed to, so he acted mysteriously. Let me tell you! Normally, I wouldn't even tell him. When you go to the Blue Sky Demon Mountain, don't dig a hole casually. Shit will be dug out. Lu Xiaoyi accompanied Ninth Master in the Nine Palaces realm for an entire day. After more than 200 years of interaction, he finally realized that this strange fat Ninth Master did not have any requests or schemes for him. Sometimes he was very childish, sometimes very black-bellied, and sometimes a little neurotic. But the more it was like this, the more real it seemed, and it made people feel closer to it. Master Jiu, when I go there, I will miss you. Lu Xiaoyi left, leaving Aju alone there wiping her tears. She was like an elder watching her child go out to explore the world. She was reluctant to part with him, but she knew that this was the general trend, and she could not stop it. She had tried her best to help this guy, but there was no result. She had thought that this was it, and their relationship was ordinary because of the bond between master and master. But now, she realized that human feelings were actually very simple. They did not need much help, and did not need to pay much. As long as you paid attention, there would definitely be results. It was a cold and windy night. Heavy snow swirled in the air, and the cold wind was bone-piercing. At the foot of Dingjun Mountain, there was a place that was regarded as a top secret by the dome. It occupied a huge area. Dozens of huge stone caves were dug along the mountain. Inside them were the sharp weapons of the Xianyuan sword sect to conquer the universe, large floating boats, and super-large treasured ships. The reason why it was built at the foot of Dingjun Mountain was because, among the 13 peaks of the dome, only Dingjun Mountain was made of solid basalt. It was abnormally solid. Digging a hole here to store these treasures would ensure the greatest safety. Lu Xiaoyi was brought to this place by Immortal Rui. They entered a huge stone cave, and then entered one of the large floating rafts that were anchored there. Then, they began to wait quietly. These big guys could not be shrunk into the rafts. In the world of cultivation, only those small individual floating rafts with a certain weight and volume could be shrunk into the rafts. It was impossible to use spatial techniques on these huge objects. The world of cultivation also had its limitations. If you wanted to understand it as a world where you could put the stars into a storage ring, it would be purely a fool's dream. There were dozens of large stone caves here. The exact number of large floating rafts and treasured ships was Xuanyuan's core secret. It was impossible to know unless one reached a certain level. A small Jin Dan like Lu Xiaoyi obviously did not have such an opportunity. Fortunately, he was not interested in it. He was not the only Jin Dan who returned to Qingkong with the ships. There were several of them. This was also a method used by Xianyuan to mobilize the strength of the strong cultivators in Qingkong. When a Jin Dan cultivator reached the later stage, they would face the great hurdle of the upper realm Yuaning. To be honest, the success rate was very low. There would always be various accidents that would force some of them to give up their dream of reaching the upper realm. For example, an incurable injury, old age, a crack in their Tao heart, failure to achieve results after many attempts, and so on. Some cultivators would slowly give up on the path to the upper realm and turn to other more practical directions to develop. For example, people like Gu Gang and the others who were in charge of the various halls of Xuanyuan's palace, or were sent out to establish their own clans, or were sent out to guard other planets. One of the most important tasks was to return to Qingkong to strengthen the backbone of the people there. Not everyone was willing to go. They were unfamiliar with the place and had to leave their homes. For cultivators like them who were older and nearing the end of their lifespans, not many were willing to leave their homes before death. However, those cultivators who came from Qingkong did not think so. They were sent to the Fifth Ring as the seeds of foundation establishment. They successfully bore Jin Dan, but were stopped before Yuaning. If they could return to their home planet, Qingkong, in the last few decades of their lives, it would be the greatest happiness for them. Therefore, every time a floating raft returned, more or less, there would be a few Jin Dan cultivators following. Their wish was to use their last few decades of energy to contribute to their home planet. Of course, there were also those who returned to their roots. They wanted to see their hometowns and see what their clans thought. Regarding this, the sect never refused. They were very familiar with each other. After all, they had fought together in the fifth ring for hundreds of years. Lu Xiaoyu was the only special one here, but no one asked him about his purpose. After hundreds of years of cultivation, they were already used to such abnormalities. Since it was the sect's arrangement, there must be a reason for it. It was not up to them to care. Chapter 565. The large floating raft was filled to the brim. In the cultivation world, there were some things that could be placed in a space bag, but there were also some that couldn't. A floating raft of a certain size was still necessary. Once everything was ready, the three true monarchs boarded the raft, and the journey began. It was only at this moment that Lu Xiaoyu began to understand what the foundation of a sect was, and what a top-notch sect was. Just like Xianyuan, in order to maintain such a large scale, 30% of the true monarchs were needed in the Clear Sky sect. True monarchs were needed in order to travel through the universe, defend the headquarters of the Five Rings, and hunt outside. In addition, there were those who went out to travel for their own purposes. For an ordinary sect, a dozen true monarchs were not enough. Just like the route between the Five Rings and the Clear Sky sect, 3 true monarchs boarded at once, and 1 Yuaning true monarch was not brought along. This meant that even though they were familiar with the route, and had traveled it countless times, the swordsmen were still prepared to fight at any time. 5 years was the distance between the Five Rings and Zhuozhou. And this was through the anti-material space. Perhaps 5 years was not a long time for a true monarch, but to the Jin Dan, they would not be able to travel like this too many times. Perfected immortals could travel through the universe without affecting their own understanding of cultivation, because what they were comprehending now was the Tao state, the Great Tao, and other mysterious things. However, Golden Core cultivators were still stuck at the stage where they needed space spiritium, which had an obvious impact on their individual cultivation. Lu Xiaoyu was still alright. The sword spirits were breaking through on the Bolang slope, and his martial arts were mostly related to the stars, so he was not affected much. The only ones affected were the other Jin Dan, but considering their current situation, it did not matter whether they cultivated or not. Other than Lu Xiaoyu, there were 6 other Jin Dan accompanying them, all of whom were from the external sword vein. From this, one could see the difference in the sword heart between the inner and outer sword veins. It was not without reason that the inner sword had led Xianyuan for tens of thousands of years. They would occasionally converse with each other, but they rarely talked about themselves. For cultivators who had reached this stage, they were all failures and sad people. Who would be willing to talk about their own unbearable matters? Among them, there was a senior brother named Tianmen who was the most talkative. Lu Xiaoyu would often ask him about the local customs and geography of the Clear Sky continent in his free time. Although Tianmen had left the Clear Sky continent for hundreds of years, he had grown up in the Clear Sky continent after all. He had achieved success in his cultivation and only went to the 5th ring after reaching the foundation establishment stage. Hundreds of years were just the blink of an eye for a domain, so his introduction was very practical. After all, it was different from a book. You have to be careful of Buddhism. Tianmen's reminder received the approval of the other Jin Dan disciples. They had more or less guessed the purpose of this young Jin Dan's trip to the Clear Sky continent. Cigarette Butt's name was very famous among the external sword veins of the Thousand Virtues Peak. He had broken the myth of the inner sword's dominance for tens of thousands of years when he was only at the foundation establishment stage. However, they did not agree with his trip to the Clear Sky continent this time. After all, Jin Dan and foundation establishment were 2 different concepts. What could be done in the foundation establishment stage might not be the same in the Jin Dan stage. They were more inclined to continue their studies for a period of time, at least 100 years. 200 years would be safer, but no one listened to their words. They were just grumbling. The Buddhist sect is flourishing in the Clear Sky continent now. The Fanzhong Island, the Thousand Islands region, and the Chuishang Plateau are all under the Buddhist sect's control. They did not establish themselves in the Five Rings, but chose to develop in a certain star field in the universe to the left. It didn't seem to be going well, so they placed their focus on the clear sky continent. As a result, the strength of the Taoist sect became slightly weaker. Some of the original Taoist powers have declined, while others have suddenly risen. After tens of thousands of years, the world has changed, and the changes are not small. It's normal for them to have some ideas. Lu Xiaoyi had a very important question. In the clear sky continent, is the rivalry between Xianyuan and the Three Pure Ones still the same as in the Five Rings? Is it more intense? Or is it softer? Tianmen nodded. You've asked the main point. The rivalry between Xianyuan and the Three Pure Ones has never changed. No matter where it is, it's just that the methods are different. In the Five Rings, it's more direct. This is also the influence of the Five Rings environment. In the clear sky continent, it's softer because they have more helpers. They don't need to rush to the front. Lu Xiaoyi understood. Senior brother, what you mean is that the Three Pure Ones instigated and supported those small and medium-sized powers? Tianmen sighed. That's right. Otherwise, how would those small and medium-sized powers dare to be disrespectful to Xianyuan and the clear sky continent? This is the most powerful thing about the Dharma lineage. They may not be able to defeat you in a cultivation war, but they can harass you for tens of thousands of years. Wherever you have territory, they can find more disciples of the Dharma lineage. They will constantly nibble away and incite conflicts, and they will profit from it. If they can't do it once, they will do it again. There will be no end to it. Lu Xiaoyi pondered. And the perfected lords are not of much use at this level? Tianmen nodded. That's right. The perfected lords are dealing with the major matters of the universe, including the perfected ones. This is the most disgusting thing about the Three Pure Ones. They strictly abide by the principle of high-level cultivators not participating in internal conflicts. Their goal is to prevent the high-level cultivators of Xianyuan from interfering in internal affairs. The high-level cultivators are crippled. They are competing with the low-level Jin Dan Foundation establishment. Our Xianyuan sword vein is alone in the clear sky continent. We are weak, but the Dharma lineage is blossoming everywhere. Young people with potential go to the Five Rings. The result is that the low-level cultivators in the clear sky continent are stretched. There are not enough of them, and their quality is not good either. You can imagine their situation. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. The Three Pure Ones strategy was very clever. It was a completely open scheme. They were competing with each other's foundation. If the young disciples of Clear Sky Continent did not support the Five Rings, but formed their own system in the Clear Sky Continent, the situation would be much better. However, this also meant that the power of the Five Rings would be weakened. More importantly, the Five Rings would have abundant spiritual opportunity, but the Foundation establishment cultivators of Clear Sky Continent would not be able to enjoy it. This was a contradiction. Xuanyuan's countermeasure was to send the outstanding Foundation establishment and Jin Dan Foundation establishment cultivators to the Five Rings. They would cultivate in the best environment for spiritual opportunity, in the most intense cultivation atmosphere, but they would struggle to survive in the Clear Sky Continent. And he was sent back to stir up *T. It was basically impossible to achieve this with one person's strength. He was afraid that he would only be able to turn the situation around during crucial events. This pressure was really not ordinary. How is the relationship between Buddhism and the Dharma lineage? Tianmen smiled bitterly. Not much. The problem is that there are no fools in the cultivation world. No matter how bad the relationship between the two sects is, they are not stupid enough to fight each other and let our sword vein benefit from it. They are all squeezing each other dry. It's just that we can't compare to the foundation of the Dharma lineage, and we can't compare to the Buddhists who are focused on one realm. This is a bit of a disadvantage. If you want to find a way to make the two sects fall out, it's difficult. Chapter 566. There was nothing interesting about traveling in the antimatter space. It was far from the grandeur of the main world's starry skies. The celestial phenomena were endless, so traveling was actually very boring. Lu Xiaoyi seized the time to make up for his cultivation in the antimatter space. Since he needed to constantly switch back and forth between the positive and negative space to practice the star system cultivation method, in fact, this kind of travel in the antimatter space was very suitable for him. There was always an end to the road. One day, 5 years later, the floating raft began to slow down. Everyone in Jingdan realized that this boring trip was coming to an end. Lu Xiaoyi was already very familiar with this process. Positioning, slowing down, breaking through barriers, passing through. He suddenly thought of the floating raft that was stuck in the passage between the positive and negative space when he formed his Aurus core. He wondered how he would feel if he was stuck there. However, he was already very familiar with the technique of entering and exiting the positive and negative space. If there were no human factors, there would be no accidents. On the left, there was a peaceful star system. Ever since the floating raft had jumped out, Lu Xiaoyi had been trying his best to communicate with the stars in this star system. The results surprised him. This place seemed to be the home of the stars. The star map in his body felt as if it was about to light up. Using the star system here, the power of his star system techniques increased by almost 10%. This was good news, especially for someone like him who came here to be a hired thug. The surrounding stars were dazzling. From the book, Lu Xiaoyi knew that there were 13 cultivation realms in the left Zhou galaxy. They were all once high-class cultivation realms. However, 10,000 years ago, there was a large-scale spiritual collapse in the left Zhou galaxy. In the subsequent recovery process, some realms never recovered. Now, there were only 7 realms in the left Zhou galaxy that still maintained the characteristics of a high-class cultivation environment. The rest had all been destroyed by time. 7? It was a little similar to the Big Dipper he practiced. It was also a long ladle. He still did not have the ability to investigate the secrets of the left Zhou galaxy. This was not within his current scope of abilities. However, he would definitely do it in the future. The Holy Land of Xuanyuan's Sword Vein? Does it sound like a big shot? The floating raft sped along, and within a few days, a green mid-sized planet appeared in his line of sight. It was much larger than the lower 3 stars, yet much smaller than the 5th ring. It was a planet brimming with vitality. This was Lu Xiaoyi's initial impression of the green sky. Among the 7 Jingdan, he was the most normal. He was considered someone who had been in the universe for a long time, so he no longer had the excitement of a rookie when it came to descending on different planets. However, the other 6 Jingdan were different. Some had tears streaming down their faces, some were staring in a daze, and some were muttering unconsciously. Lu Xiaoyi could understand their feelings. Mortals had left home at a young age for dozens of years. After working hard for their entire lives, they were finally able to return to their roots in their remaining years. What kind of feelings did these Jingdan have? On this point, there was no difference between a cultivator and a mortal. This was the emotional blind spot that humans were born with, and could never be erased. The floating raft began to decelerate once again. After finding a spot, it cut through the atmosphere. After passing through the first thick layer of clouds, their vision cleared. Under the clear sky, a huge snowy mountain range appeared before their eyes. It was ancient, heavy, and silently stood there. The vicissitudes of history and the sharpening of metal made this snowy mountain range, which did not seem as majestic as the 5th ring's dome, have a sharpness of its own. It was pure. This was not something that was given to it by appearance, but was shaped by history. This was Mount E. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Senior sister was right. This was the Holy Land of Xuanyuan's Sword Vein, and it was fully deserving of the title. The floating raft landed under the glow of the snowy mountain. It was also a spacious rocky land. There were dozens of huge caves on the surrounding rock walls. Obviously, the purpose of this place was the same as the caves under Dingjun Peak in the Fifth Ring, which was to store large floating rafts. Judging from the number of caves, the Blue Sky Mountain would always be the last home of the Xianyuan sword sect. Defend Mount E, and Xianyuan will live forever. On the ground, there was a large group of cultivators waiting. There were perfected cultivators, and Jean Dan. They were going to carry out the handover on the spot. This was also the tradition of the swordsmen. They were not used to stopping and resting for a few months. They would drag on the handover and take their time to set sail. In the words of the Heavenly Gate, this was a wartime rule. Within 2 hours, the goods and personnel had to be handed over. The floating raft had to rise again. If they wanted to rest, they had to return to the Fifth Ring. The significance of this was that the Xianyuan swordsmen could always maintain the state of being ready to go to war at any time. They would not be delayed by trivial matters, and they would not slack off because of the habits they had developed over time. Hearing the news of war and moving in full force was not something that could be represented by just a few words. It was also not something that could be achieved just by having this belief in one's heart. It also needed to be cultivated in daily life to be able to truly achieve the level of flying swords flying through the sky with a single command. There were specialized perfected cultivators who took inventory of the goods, one by one, the quantity and quality, and then moved down. Lu Xiaoyi and 7 other Jin and cultivators got off the raft, followed by hundreds of young Zhuji cultivators. There were also a few lucky Jindan cultivators who formed their Jindan in the Blue Sky sect. They were all going to the Fifth Ring to start another magnificent cultivation life. A few perfected cultivators were chatting there, exchanging information about the major events of the past 5 years. After an hour, all the exchanges were completed. The 3 perfected cultivators returned to the floating raft and immediately soared into the sky, disappearing without a trace. They were about to begin their next 5-year journey. Lu Xiaoyi was very emotional. This was probably the difference between the sword vein and the Dharma vein. The sword vein was able to compress time to the extreme, perfectly complementing the swordsman's characteristic of doing everything quickly. It was able to fully ensure that they would not be at a disadvantage in battle despite having fewer people. All of this had to be done bit by bit in life and cultivation. 2 perfected cultivators came over, and one of them announced, "Tianmen Tianxiang, the 6 of you, follow me. The Soaring Heaven Pavilion will arrange new positions for you." His name was not mentioned, but Lu Xiaoyi was not surprised. After all, he had returned for a different purpose in the first place. He had not returned to retire as a rice worm. The other perfected cultivator looked at him suspiciously. "Cigarette butt? Do you understand your responsibility in coming to the Blue Sky Pavilion this time?" Lu Xiaoyi nodded. "I understand. Allow me to settle down for a while, then I will report to the Soaring Heaven Pavilion." However, the perfected cultivator interrupted him. "There's no time to settle down. There's an important dispute that requires support right now. The mission overview and background are all in the Jade Slip, and there's also a map of the northern region. You can directly teleport there, that'll be faster." Lu Xiaoyi did not refute. He had come here to work. To a cultivator, there was no such thing as rest. Was 5 years of rest on the floating raft not enough? He had just soared into the air when he landed back down. "Sorry, Marshal Uncle, where do I teleport?" The perfected cultivator led the way in front and instructed. "The main teleportation array of Mount Shao is at Rainbow Hollow. This place is different from the Fifth Ring. At the very least, many places in the northern region can be teleported there. There's no need to fly or hurry there." All the teleportation arrays in the northern region are in the map I gave you. You have to familiarize yourself with them as soon as possible. In the future, this will be your most important method of action. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. It seemed that the pace of his days in the Blue Sky Pavilion was very fast. Chapter 567. While he was on his way to Rainbow Hollow, Lu Xiaoyi hurriedly glanced at the mission jade slip. He had a rough idea of the whole story. The good thing about the mission in the northern region was that he didn't have to investigate, verify, or discover the truth. Xianyuan had been in his territory for tens of thousands of years. Their power was deeply entrenched, and nothing could be hidden from them. Lu Xiaoyi's main task was to solve it. It was to be a hired thug. In the cultivation world, no matter how you planned, in the end, you still had to rely on your strength to speak. Rainbow Hollow was the transmission pivot of Xianyuan's sword sect in the northern region. Dozens of transmission formations were arranged in an orderly manner. It was a spectacular sight. They led to all parts of the northern region, including the main sects, cities, and important places. It was guaranteed that no matter where you went in the northern region, you would be able to find the nearest transmission point. The remaining distance could be covered by flying in a very short time. Jima Peninsula? After comparing the mission jade slip and the map, Lu Xiaoyi confirmed his transmission point, but he still asked. The immortal nodded. Yes, Jima Peninsula. The Azure Sky world was divided into 7 regions, including the Donglin continent, the Shiga Sand continent, the Nanluo Peace continent, the Hanzhou continent of the northern region, the Chuanchang Plateau, the Thousand Island region, and the Fangzhang Buddhist kingdom. Among them, the east, south, west, and north continents were the largest continents, each with dozens of countries. This was a domain with a long history. Over the long river of time, the forces of cultivation had constantly changed. Let's not talk about the distant past, because it was meaningless to talk about it too far away. 11,000 years ago, the cultivation landscape of the Azure Sky Big World had undergone an earth-shaking change. There were 2 reasons for the change. First, earlier on, the Azure Sky World of Cultivation participated in the magnificent expedition to Sirius. After their success, they named the Sirius Star region as the 5 Rings. Since then, they had a broader and more spiritual world. No one was willing to give up such a world, so a large-scale interstellar migration began. The sects and forces with some strength all had their own territories on the 5 Rings, which was the embryonic form of the 5 Rings. However, the mother planet Blue Sky was also undergoing a huge change. This was because a large number of top-notch factions and sects had begun to shift their attention to the 5th ring. Naturally, this created a certain degree of power vacuum in Blue Sky. Heroes rose from all directions, each displaying their own abilities. This was the first reason. The second reason was even more fatal. In the thousands of years after a large number of cultivators began to leave the Blue Sky Great World, the spiritual vigor of the Blue Sky Great World began to show signs of collapse. The same situation also occurred in the other realms of the left peripheral galaxy. It was a mysterious phenomenon of the entire galaxy's spiritual vigor disappearing. This was a nightmare for cultivators. Without spiritual opportunity, or if the spiritual opportunity was maintained at an extremely low level, this place would become a low-level cultivation realm. How could there be any future? If the first interstellar migration was to pursue a better cultivation environment, then the second interstellar migration was purely because they had no choice. It was more tragic, and more helpless. It was still better for the big sects, as they had their own way of leaving. However, it was a pity for those forces whose highest level of cultivation was only Jin Dan. They could only guard their realms and had nowhere to go. They could not count on those big sects to be kind. They were already struggling to make ends meet when they moved, let alone these small sects that were as numerous as the hairs on a cow. This was the darkest moment of the Blue Sky Great World of Cultivation. In the thousands of years, almost the entire bottom layer of the cultivation world was destroyed. The spiritual vigor was weak and could not produce new blood. Countless orthodoxies had broken off. Other than a few top sects that still had a trace of power left due to historical reasons, the rest of the cultivation forces were almost completely wiped out. The change occurred 11,000 years ago. Due to a reason that he still did not understand, the spiritual vigor of the left peripheral galaxy began to recover overnight. It was a mysterious recovery, just like how it mysteriously disappeared in the beginning. Needless to say, this was bound to cause an even bigger wave of return. With this departure and return, 90% of the original middle and low cultivation forces of the blue sky great world were gone. The entire structure of the world had undergone earth-shaking changes. The former glory was gone, but a single spark could start a prairie fire. After 10,000 years of growth, part of the orthodoxies returned. Under the nourishment of the spiritual vigor, various cultivation forces developed tenaciously again. However, the structure of the world was very different from 10,000 years ago. Let's not talk about the distant places. Let's talk about the northern region, the Jima Peninsula. This was originally the territory of another sect in the northern region that could compete with the Xianyuan sword sect, the Surging Waves Pavilion. However, the Surging Waves Pavilion was the first to act in the expedition against the Celestial Wolf sect. They did not put in any effort. As a result, the Surging Waves Pavilion was only given a very small piece of land in the Fifth Ring, which was not even as large as the Kun Daoli realm. This caused the originally powerful Dharma cultivation sect to fall into a dilemma. They had no choice but to focus on their home planet, the Blue Sky Great World, because their strength was not enough to compete in the Fifth Ring. As the spiritual vigor of the Blue Sky Great World collapsed, the situation worsened and they had no choice but to move all their members to the Fifth Ring. In that period of history, the strength of the Xianyuan sword sect increased by leaps and bounds. With proper strategies and brave cultivators, they laid a solid foundation for the sect's strength in the future. On the other hand, the Surging Waves Pavilion, which was also a big sect in the northern region, wavered between the Fifth Ring and the Blue Sky Great World. They missed the opportunity to develop and their strength became weaker and weaker. In the end, they could only struggle at death's door in the Fifth Ring. Although they were also of the Dharma cultivation sect, they had a harmonious relationship with the Xianyuan sect for a long time. In addition, they did not think about making progress, so they did not adapt to the Fifth Ring's cultivation environment. They also could not tolerate the Dharma cultivation giants like the Supreme Three Pure Ones. The turning point appeared after the Blue Sky Great World's spiritual vigor recovered. After careful consideration, the Surging Waves Pavilion decided to put most of their strength in the Blue Sky Great World. However, they had already lost their foothold in the Blue Sky Great World. It was not driven away by others, but by their own initiative to withdraw because of the spiritual vigor. Back then, there was only one decisive force, the Xianyuan sword sect. Even the Three Pure Ones at that time did not dare to speak in front of Xianyuan. During that short period of time, Xianyuan was at its most glorious. In the Blue Sky Great World and the Fifth Ring, no one dared to doubt their words. This was because it was said that Xianyuan had a swordsman who became an immortal. The recovery of the Zhuozhou's spiritual vigor was also thanks to this immortal. At that time, there were only a few top sects left in the Blue Sky Great World. Xianyuan, the Three Pure Ones, Tai, the Ju Zen Temple. When the Blue Sky Great World's spiritual vigor recovered, it immediately caused the original powers to fight for it. However, if they wanted to re-enter the upper realm, they could not avoid Xianyuan. Without Xuanyuan's approval, no one dared to return. They were all afraid of angering the Xianyuan immortal. It was said that the immortal had a bad temper and had countless blood debts. Under such circumstances, Xianyuan and the various powers reached an agreement to redistribute the continents in the Blue Sky Great World in the long run. Taoist giants like the Three Pure Ones had no choice but to lower their heads. Originally, among the Three Pure Ones, Tai Qing occupied Nanluoning Prefecture, Shangqing occupied Zaigosa Prefecture, and Yuqing dominated Dahailin Prefecture. They occupied 3 of the 4 most important prefectures. How could Xianyuan at that time tolerate this? Therefore, the first condition of redistributing the prefectures was for Yuqing to leave Donghailin Prefecture and go to Nanluoning Prefecture to be neighbors with Tai Qing. The three pure ones went from having 3 prefectures in the blue sky great world to having 2. This was the price of compromise. There were countless similar disputes between Xianyuan and the 3 pure ones that could not be mediated. In fact, it was not like who was bullying who. In a period of time, whoever was stronger had the advantage. Every dog has its day. This was the essence of it. Chapter 568. This empty Eastern Sealin state was given to a few other orthodoxies, including the Surging Waves Pavilion. There could only be one master in Han state of the northern region. It could only be Xianyuan. The Surging Waves Pavilion knew this very well. They did not dare to fight for it, nor did they want to stay in the northern region. The pressure on Mount Shao was too great, and it was not good for the growth of young people. Therefore, they were satisfied with Xuanyuan's arrangement. Xianyuan had made many similar arrangements. Of course, he tried his best to arrange the sects and forces that were close to him to come back, and kept those loyal old officials of the 3 pure ones out of the door. He also arranged the Surging Waves Pavilion in Dahai, and found the Qianzhao Temple and let them return to the Chuancheng Plateau. The history was very complicated. Even a cultivator like Lu Xiaoyi would have a headache reading it. He could only get a general understanding of it for the time being. Jima Peninsula was where the original Surging Waves Pavilion was located. Now that the Surging Waves Pavilion was empty, it became an ownerless place, which caused countless small sects to fight for it. Of course, no matter how they fought for it, they had to pay tribute to the overlord, Xianyuan, which was inevitable. Because of the terrain, Mount Yi was located in the northernmost part of the snowy mountain range, while Mount Ji was located in the southernmost part of the coast. They were far apart. When there were 2 major forces, such a location was perfect. But now there was only Xianyuan here, so it felt a little out of reach, especially when the middle and low-level disciples of Xianyuan were not strong enough. There were countless disputes, and Xianyuan was also in a terrible fix. The ice guest hugged her master nervously. Master! Master! What's wrong with you? Is your internal disease acting up? I have already given you the heaven-mending pill. If you know, tell me what to do. Spells were flying above their heads, and there were countless spectators below, waving flags and shouting, and watching the enemy. But no one cared about the few Foundation establishment swordsmen in the corner of the battlefield. The Jin Dan swordsman was lying on the ground. He could not move his chi by himself, so he could only look to the north. His disciple, the ice guest, cried, Master, I have sent a green bird message to Mount Shao. I think reinforcements will be here soon. Please hold on a little longer. When the martial uncles arrive, everything will be fine. Jin Dan swordsman coughed up a mouthful of blood and fainted. Another Foundation establishment cultivator suggested, Senior brother Bingku, martial uncle has fainted. Do you think we should leave this place first? It's too dangerous here. If any magical techniques slip through, without senior uncle, how are we supposed to defend against them? The ice guest shook her head resolutely. No way! The green bird has already sent a message. I don't know which martial uncle is coming. If he can't see us and doesn't understand the cause and effect, it will be troublesome. Moreover, it will also delay the treatment of Master. We will wait here and not go anywhere. I don't believe that these heartless bastards would dare to do anything to us. The swordsmen were speechless. Even their senior uncle had been reduced to such a state? What's there to boast about? However, they couldn't say anything discouraging, so they could only wait for the situation to develop. Overall, as long as they didn't recklessly get involved, there probably wouldn't be any trouble. The ice guest hugged her master, sorrow welling up in her heart. The few of them had followed their master to mediate the Battle of Jima Peninsula. It wasn't part of the fixed plan. Su Anyuan's arrangements in the northern region had always been lacking in manpower. There were less than 200 Jin Dan cultivators in Mount Shao. Excluding those who still wanted to strive for a higher position, those who were engaged in education in various halls, those who were too old and weak to fly, and those who had left their sex to establish families, there were only a few dozen who were truly capable of carrying out missions in the northern region. The northern region was so big that it was really impossible to allocate manpower. In view of the many disputes between the various small and medium-sized forces, they simply divided the work into different areas. Each area was assigned a Jin Dan cultivator and several Foundation establishment cultivators to patrol and deal with the countless troubles. Actually, these low-level cultivators couldn't understand why an overlord like Su Anyuan would end up in such a state in his own territory. Was the fifth ring so important? If they sent a few strong cultivators back, these sneaky cultivators would be wiped out immediately. How would they end up in such a situation? Their level was limited, so of course, they couldn't understand the direction of the decisions made by the higher-ups. It was normal for them to have such complaints. Now, the middle and low-level cultivators left in Mount Shao were all crooked. They were the leftovers, or those who didn't have lofty ideals and lacked the will of a swordsman. This was also the norm in the cultivation world. After all, only a few people were truly qualified to become a qualified swordsman. Not everyone had a tenacious and indomitable heart. Mediocrity was always the main tone. The master and the apprentices, as well as a few senior and junior brothers, were the core forces in charge of maintaining order in Jima Peninsula. It sounded a bit ridiculous, but it was the truth. Immortals and immortals wouldn't appear in the battles within the northern region. This was the principle that the major sects in Green Sky sect kept an eye on each other. Xianyuan wouldn't make a move because the three pure ones had more people. The three pure ones wouldn't make a move because they were afraid that the great cultivators of the fifth ring Xianyuan would come back and kill them. Moreover, they had a great advantage in the middle and low-level cultivators now, so there was no need for them to make a move. The miscellaneous small and medium-sized sects didn't dare to make a move because they were afraid that they would be annihilated by the major sects. Usually, they couldn't find such an opportunity. Once the trivial immortals and immortals made a move, they would immediately give the Xianyuan three pure ones a reason to criticize them. How could they forgive them so easily? Therefore, the vast Green Sky sect became the world of the middle and low-level cultivators. Ice Guest was one of the few swordsmen who could find a master when he was in the level of building foundation. It wasn't because he had a strong ability, but because he had a sweet mouth and knew how to get things done. In addition, he also pestered and begged. Of course, his master wasn't that great either. He was lucky to have formed his Aurus essence at an old age, but his strength was very embarrassing. This was not his first master. When he was in the stage of eating chi, he had once worshipped a building foundation cultivator as his master, but later his master was killed when he went out. This was his second time worshipping a master. If his master died this time, who would dare to accept him as a disciple in Mount Shao? Cultivators believed in ghosts, gods, mysteries, and fated chances. His experience was a jinx to his master. Therefore, he was really worried and sad for his master, and it wasn't an act. The Battle of Jima Peninsula this time was a bit unexpected. He and his master had been in Jima Peninsula for 7 or 8 years, and they knew the small and medium-sized forces like the back of their hands. However, they still didn't know why they were suddenly on fire. After they knew about it, they hurried over, but they didn't expect that things would go out of control. There were 4 sects present, and they were all forces around Jima Peninsula. The longer one had a history of several thousand years, and the shorter one had a history of at least 1,000 years. They were all powerful sects with immortals in charge of their forces, and they had been eyeing Jima Peninsula for a long time. Jima Peninsula was where the top force in Green Sky sect, the mountain gate of the Surging Waves Pavilion, was located. Although the Surging Waves Pavilion had left here for 10,000 years, the overall structure of Jima Peninsula was still intact. It was a real feng shui treasure land, and it was inevitable that it would be coveted by others. However, Xianyuan had never thought of handing over this treasure land to others, because he was afraid that a disobedient sect would appear here. But recently, the attitude of Mount Shao had changed. In order to stabilize the increasing disputes among cultivators near the South Sea of the northern region, they intended to support an obedient sect to manage this place. This might also be the reason for the conflict. Chapter 569. The Narcissus sect had a long history of thousands of years. Actually, everyone knew who was behind them. It was the Surging Waves Pavilion in the Eastern Sea. Because they were still brooding over their former residence, even though the Surging Waves Pavilion could never be taken back, they still supported a sect to guard this place. It could be said that they were doing the ancestors of the sect a little justice. The Chronicle Temple had an even longer history, spanning thousands of years. It had always been mild and cautious in its speech and actions. However, its strength was restrained, and there were always outstanding people appearing. After a long time, it could no longer be hidden. After all, everyone was so familiar with each other. Their backing was the Three Pure Ones. However, they always followed the rules. It was difficult for Xianyuan to grasp their weakness. There were so many Taoist temples in the world, they could not rely on rumors and guesses. The Dushan sect was a body cultivator sect. It was established relatively late, less than 1,000 years ago. Xianyuan suspected that it was a Buddhist sect, but there was no evidence. The Buddhist sect's mastery of body techniques was not below that of body cultivators. It was not impossible for them to adapt and change their appearance. The last force was the South Sea Demon clan. It was unknown what was wrong with them, but they still wanted to come ashore to test their skills. These four forces fought over the possibility that Xianyuan might designate the Jima Peninsula as a free land. They fought over the right to speak and gain actual control. Then, they would negotiate with Xianyuan about the future rules and regulations. When Bingku's master arrived with her disciples, the fight had already turned into a mess. Although this Jin Dan swordsman's strength was average, he was ambitious. As the overlord of the northern region, he had a good grasp of his identity. He rashly entered the fight and tried to stop a large-scale conflict. He thought that was Xuanyuan's identity. No one would dare to be presumptuous. In the end, he went overboard. His thinking was right. Xianyuan had the responsibility to control the situation of the northern region. He would not allow the situation to escalate. Now it was a fight between Jin Dan cultivators. In the future, it might expand to Foundation establishment cultivators. It would be too late to stop it when it involved mortals. It would also be detrimental to Xuanyuan's image in the northern region. His thinking was good, but he did not consider his own ability. In a chaotic battle, there would always be people stirring up trouble and taking advantage of it. And he became the catalyst for the chaos. Who was it that hurt him? The ice guest and the other laying foundation cultivators couldn't understand it either. The sky was too messy, and it was filled with spells. It seemed that anyone could do it, but it also seemed that no one did it on purpose. But now, the overlord Xianyuan was standing at the side, as if he had become a spectator. It was very awkward. He might as well not have come. Bingku felt aggrieved and let his imagination run wild. Originally, he liked to watch cultivators fight, but in his eyes, it became boring. Until he heard the voice of his junior fellow apprentice, Bing Shuang. "Senior brother, martial uncle, he doesn't seem to be able to make it." Only then did the ice guest come to her senses. She felt that the breath of her master in her arms began to disperse, sometimes strong and sometimes weak. She knew that this was a sign of collapse, and she felt sad. At this moment, a voice came from the side. "Help him! Hurry up and leave!" The icy guest was furious. Someone actually instigated him to kill his master. Was he still human? He turned around and saw an unfamiliar young man with a sword on his back standing at the side. He didn't look at him, but only focused on the battle in the sky. Judging from his breath, he should be a Jean Dan. The few laying foundation disciples immediately understood that this was the support from Mount E. But they didn't know why he didn't go up to stop the fight, but was here to instigate him to kill his master. Marshal, uncle! Master is dying, please save him! Lu Xiaoyi didn't even look. This senior fellow apprentice's dantian was already shattered, and even a deity couldn't save him. Moreover, in this last period of time, he would be tortured by losing the protection of his mana. What disappointed him was that these laying foundation disciples were too soft and emotional. They didn't have a trace of the ruthlessness of a swordsman. A real swordsman was ruthless to others, and to himself. I cultivate the sword, not the art of alchemy. Your master is incurable. If you dawdle, you will only make him suffer. You are his disciple. Even if you can't solve his problem, can't you solve his pain? The icy guest was at a loss. The hierarchy in Xianyuan was very strict. Master was not here, and Marshal Uncle's words were heaven. He also knew that Marshal Uncle's words were very reasonable. After all, he had the cultivation of the late stage of laying foundation. He had common sense. He knew that once a cultivator lost the protection of his mana, his bodily functions would return to the tolerance level of a mortal. Facing this kind of damage, it was really torturous. But, if you kill your master, you will be punished by heaven. Lu Xiaoyi disdained. Heaven's punishment is only for those who deserve it. Heaven is not that blind. The icy guest cried out loudly. As he cried, he moved his palm to his master's chest. He called his master and exerted force in his palm, shattering his master's heart acupoint. At the last moment, he saw a trace of a smile at the corner of his master's mouth after he was released. Until now, he finally accepted this martial uncle, because his master didn't blame him. As a disciple, he did what he should do. Who can tell me what's going on here? The ice guest's heart was still agitated, and she was uneasy. Beside her, Bing Shuang was still calm. She told the whole story from beginning to end. Lu Xiaoyi remained calm and collected. This senior brother was injured by a spell. The coldine entered his body and spread throughout his meridians. He could only roughly see this. As for what kind of spell it was and which orthodoxy it came from, it was difficult for him. He had been observing the fight between the 10 Jean Dan in the sky for some time, but unfortunately, he couldn't see anything. Moreover, the one who really did it would definitely hide his skills and wouldn't continue to use his dark skills in public. Therefore, this was not a way out. Do you know these people? The icy guest finally recovered. I don't know them, but my master has mentioned them before, so I have some impression of them. The ones from Narcissus sect are Taoists Yushui and Taoist Shualang. They are wearing green robes and tall crowns. The ones from Dushan sect are Qianli, Zong Jiao Jiakan. The ones from Jishou Abbey are Taoist Jin Yen and Taoist Wei Yen. I don't know the rest. The 3 sea beasts are of unknown origin. I only know that one of them is the Yanshui beast. It often comes to Jima Peninsula. Lu Xiaoyi compared them one by one and had a rough understanding. It wasn't easy to deal with this kind of situation when he just arrived. Killing without caring about anything was not the way to deal with it. Because the reason why someone secretly attacked this external sword senior brother was probably because he wanted to provoke Xianyuan. It would be satisfying to go up and kill, but it would be a bad idea to fall into someone else's trap. He was indeed here to be a fighter, but there were different types of fighters with brains and without brains. He didn't want to be someone else's knife. He wasn't too impulsive about the death of his fellow disciples. Since he chose the orthodoxy of swordsmen, he had to face life and death. How could he be so angry? In the 5th ring, such things happened every day. Lu Xiaoyi had killed many people, but he didn't see anyone coming to him. This was the awareness of a cultivator. If you didn't understand this, you couldn't survive in the cultivation world. Sooner or later, you would be provoked to death. Therefore, he encouraged this young foundation establishment to give his master a quick death. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.